I start now? When do I go? Wait a little bit. All right. There I am. Ready? All right. Wa Shang Hao. That's Chinese, as best as I can pronounce it, for good evening. Episode 1. Sun turns, moon turns, sun turns, moon. And so we begin at the beginning. This is China. And this is China. And this is also China. It is a land of contrasts. A land of breathtaking, almost otherworldly beauty. And it is a land of appalling, revolting hideousness. It is a colossal land, stretching from the azure waters of the Pacific Ocean to the towering peaks of the Himalayan mountains, from the lonely sands of the Gobi Desert to the sweltering forests of the Red River. And for almost 10,000 years, the people who have called this land their home are no less a people of contrasts, of contradictions, of riddles, wrapped in mysteries, wrapped in riddles. These are Chinese people. They are simultaneously one people and many peoples, bathed in an elaborate history that reaches back about as far as human memory will permit. They are the inheritors of perhaps the oldest, most venerable culture mankind has ever produced. A culture that gave to the world the compass, the crossbow, the umbrella, gunpowder, paper, porcelain, egg rolls, wontons, MSG-related illnesses, but somehow never managed to invent knives, forks, or spoons.
Spoon! Anyway, how is your sex life?
At times, the Chinese have been unified into one of several great dynastic empires, whose artistic and technological achievements rank among the finest of human endeavor. And at other times, they've gone bing, bang, bong, pow, ping, ow, slaughtering one another wholesale in a bloody pattern of dynasty, civil war, dynasty, civil war. Like the majestic motions of distant celestial bodies, China is always changing. But also like the distant celestial, China always stays the same. Night gives way to day, day gives way to night. The wild goose prances in the apricot blossoms, the slumberous tiger yawns in the shadow of the plum tree, and so on. You get the point. The other thing you'll probably already know about the Chinese is that there are a whole
multitude
load of them. 1.3 billion to be exact, of which I could name maybe 3. Xi Jinping, Yao Ming, and Liu Kang. That's way too many Chinese if you ask me. As a civilizational stratagem, the Chinese opted for the swarm approach, which works fairly well in the early to mid-game, but proves unsustainable once the other factions start tech leveling. My father used to say that Chinese women laid eggs like hens, and I believed him for upwards of 40 years until a regrettable incident occurred between myself and a Chinese colleague. Still, I remain steadfast in my belief that the Chinese are genetic superiors. Like the clever mouse, their morphology allows them to contort their bodies into the most cramped of tiny spaces, such as your typical Chinese apartment building. Your average
man from China
can also subsist on half the food of a lesser man and still cogitate at an extremely high level. It is for these reasons that I fully anticipate to one day welcome our Chinese overlords, to whom I offer my services as a humble historian. Just don't castrate me like that one guy. What's his name? Sima Qian. Yeah, him. Look, you just keep that it away from me. Not that the wife is all that keen these days anyway. Yeah, you heard what I said. But seriously, of all the big, dumb revolutions of the past century or two, the Chinese Revolution was by far the most, Chinese. On the one hand, you could say it was the most successful, in the sense that the People's Republic of China has effectively filled the void of the Soviet Union as the world's biggest boogeyman. On the other hand, you could say it was the least successful, in the sense that the Chinese have all but abandoned communism for a far more traditional authoritarian system, one that bears more than a passing resemblance to the everlasting bureaucracies of the former imperial Chinese states. It may also have been the bloodiest, most miserable revolution to date, with none of the romantic optimism of the French, nor the intellectual bravura of the Russian. Marxists these days seem almost embarrassed by it, and seldom if ever rise to its defense, unlike the familiar litanies of simping apologia regularly recited on behalf of all those Bolshevik
practitioners of sexual deviancy.
Like everything else made in China, the Chinese Revolution is an inferior copy, a poor imitation of far more interesting social upheavals, but I have a lecture series to finish, goddammit, and I don't care how long it takes or how many lives I destroy in the process. I'm going to tell these stories of human folly, error, and hubris because I must, because the public needs to be informed, and because left to your own devices, you youngsters simply can't be bothered to do the reading. You may not like this any more than I do, but we're going to get through it together. Let me take you on a journey of discovery, into the contrasts, and the cycles, and the grand drama of
China. 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 China.
Oh God, what have I gotten myself into? Episode 2. Curious beetle prod hasty grasshopper, prudent mouse bide his time. This is China. The really real this time, China. So here are some sights. There's the Yangtze River, I believe. Not sure what that is. Shanghai, largest city. Peking, of course. Who's this giant fat guy supposed to be? Oh wait, never mind. Some farms, I guess. Oh, isn't that nice? They're smiling. Although, to be perfectly frank, I sometimes wonder if China even exists. That it isn't a fictitious entity like Santa Claus or Helen Keller, cooked up by economists and political commentators to justify their phony baloney jobs at various think tanks that refuse to hire me. What do these people have that I don't have, I'd like to know? And why do they all look related? I mean, did George Will wander the country like Johnny Appleseed, sowing scions at every rustic one-stoplight town? Have the gates to Erebus finally opened and the armies of Hades poured out from their numberless Thonian mansions? Oh, so sorry I barged into your little club. Anyway, according to one of these experts, deceased American sinologist Lucian Pye, China is a civilization masquerading as a country. Now, just what the hell does that mean? Well, I think it's an attempt to illustrate just how enormous the concept of China actually is. Truly, it is a continent's worth of peoples, kingdoms, empires, wars, myths, legends, and lore, all packed into one. As a geopolitical entity, China is what Europe would have been had the Roman Empire never collapsed into ignominy, but had instead simply suffered through several changes in management. Speaking of the Romans, there are, strangely enough, many points of similarity. Like the Romans, the Chinese always put the family name first, and so one finds a proliferation of several common Chinese names, including but not limited to Li Han, Han Li, Li Han Han Li, Yu Wong, Yu Hu, Hu Ha, Long Dong, Huge Wang, and Tiny Peeny. To continue, the modern Chinese language, now called Standard Chinese, is descended from Mandarin, which was, like Latin in the West, the lingua franca of scholars and officials for well over 1,000 years, despite the fact that a single misplaced vowel sound or tone can mean the difference between I would like another cupcake
我是中文学生
and please come over here and sit on my face.
谢谢不用谢
These are historical facts. Now how about all this, balderdash? What are all these strokes and squiggles supposed to mean? Oh, there's 50,000 of them, are there? And each character represents a different object or concept, do they? Well, what do you want from me? Do you want me to coo and awe over the ornate calligraphy like some Upper East Side pansy? 'Cause I won't. Looks like a piece of fly paper to me. It goes without saying the Chinese writing system is pictorial in origin. It evolved over thousands of years from crude etchings on the bones of dead animals, gee, I wonder what this is supposed to represent, to the elaborate and mystifying gibberish we see today. Look, China, you don't get a prize for making things harder than they need to be. You do this all the time, whether it be language, writing, mathematics, even dining. You don't have to turn everything into some kind of goddamn art form. You're just showing off, aren't you? Pathetic. And that's another thing. The Chinese get way too much credit for being innovative. So they came up with gunpowder. Whoop-de-doo. They had that for like 500 years, and in all that time, nobody ever thought about putting some into a little metal tube with a little metal ball and making it go... Oh, wait a minute, I guess they did. But the point stands. The Chinese invent both gunpowder and guns and then confidently assume everyone else is too stupid to replicate or more accurately improve upon their genius. Or how about this thing? Something called a pig toilet.
It's disgusting. I don't want to talk about it.
How did it work? Well, there's this little wooden seat, and inside this seat is a little round hole, and beneath this hole is a pigsty, generally containing pigs. The pigs eat from the owners until they are slaughtered and themselves consumed, feeding yet more pigs in what some moderns surely think is an elegant and sustainable cycle.
Honestly, it was disgusting.
Meanwhile, around the same time, who else but the Romans had figured out a little thing called running water. Not that it's all that likely, but if I were to comedically slip and fall into a time machine at any point, I know in which set of space-time coordinates I'd much prefer to evacuate my bowel. Moving on. Religion. There are lots of them. There's this one, and this one too. In China, throughout the ages, the two most prominent religions were Buddhism, imported from India in the 2nd century, and Taoism, a homegrown philosophy that got haphazardly mixed up with a whole bunch of traditional codswallop. You know, it always yanks my chain whenever people complain about Christianity as if it were solely responsible for the ongoing ignorance of mankind. Do you people have any idea just how
cognitively impaired
most religions are? Tell me if this makes any sense at all. There was once this guy called the Jade Emperor, who was born in the kingdom of pure felicity and majestic heavenly lights, wherever that is, and was originally the assistant of the Jade Pure One, or the celestial venerable of the primordial beginning, who was himself one of the 3 pure ones, or the 3 pristine clarities, the rulers of the 3 heavens who may or may not have been born out of the Hundun, otherwise known as the heavenly king of the chaotic never-ending primordial beginning. Everybody with me so far? Good, because this gets complicated. It is said the heavenly king of the chaotic never-ending primordial beginning was itself a manifestation of the great Tao, which produced the Jade Pure One previously mentioned, which produced the Supreme Pure One, or the Lord of Numinous Treasure, who, as the custodian of Yin and Yang, next produced the Grand Pure One, or the Lord of the Way and Virtue, at least until the Jade Emperor. Wait a minute, that's not the Jade Emperor, that's Kendra Jade. Who I definitely don't know who she is, attained immortality by passing the 3,200 trials, each lasting 3 million years, and thereby banishing the 4 great dragons. Now, the 4 great dragons were each buried beneath a different mountain from which sprang the 4 great rivers, yellow, black, red, and white, which incidentally represent the 4 cardinal directions, after which the Jade Emperor was retroactively promoted to creator and emperor of all things, including the 3 pure ones, chose the 12 sacred animals of the zodiac, and appointed his eventual successor, who will one day rule as the heavenly master of the dawn of Jade of the Golden Dawn.
Don't make fun of the Chinese people. Make fun, not funny.
Basically, the whole of Chinese cosmology is a Fast and Furious movie.
Hey, brother.
Episode 3. Heavenly waters flowing down mighty mountain feed rising people. Our story begins here. No, more like over there. Keep going. Keep going. A little further. Come on, I don't have all day. Wait, stop. Stop, you moron. There. This is the Yellow River, or the Huanghe. It is one of the world's great rivers, along with the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Yangtze, also in China, one of the so-called cradles of civilization. In its long, meandering journey across the northwestern plateau, the Yellow River steadily gathers millions of tons of nutrient-rich silt, called loess, which aside from giving the river its muddy complexion, also transforms the nearby plains into some of the most fertile farmland in all the world. But there is a problem. Unlike the Nile, which seasonally floods in a predictable manner, the Yellow River is a wild river. Its floods can come any time during the year, or sometimes not at all, and like a female motorist, it has a bad habit of suddenly and drastically altering course. The Yellow River's acutely feminine disposition proved a major hurdle for the ancient Chinese. To tame the wild waters, a man called Yu the Great supposedly devised the intricate system of irrigation that made Chinese civilization possible. Now, Yu the Great was the descendant of the mythical Huangdi, or Yellow Emperor, one of the highest deities of the 5 regions, or alternatively, one of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors who in time immemorial vanquished the felonious Flame Emperor and some other guy who had 4 eyes and 6 arms, thus laying the foundation for the Chinese state. These are historical facts. Thenceforward, according to the grand historian Sima Qian, the dynastic cycle officially began. And we will go through them now, one by one, whether you like it or not, so pay attention. The Xia dynasty. Probably didn't exist. Moving on. The Shang dynasty.
Mr. I'll make a man out of you.
Famous for oracle bones, bronze cookware, and probably some other things. The Zhao dynasty. Founded when King Wu of Zhao overthrew King Zhao of Shang, which is a little confusing. To justify their conquest, the Zhao clan introduced the concept of the Mandate of Heaven, in which the gods demonstrate their approval or disapproval of the current ruler by sending droughts, plagues, madness, disease, etc., etc.
You know you make me wanna
Zhao.
kick my heels up and
Zhao.
throw my hands up and
Zhao.
throw my hands back.
Zhao.
Come on now.
Alright, enough. The Spring and Autumn period. The Zhao dynasty slowly disintegrates into several feudal princedoms, during which time the so-called 100 schools of thought flourished. The general Sun Tzu writes his seminal text, The Art of War, which, if you know anything at all about the Chinese, recommends a very sneaky kind of war. On the other hand, you had the philosopher Lao Tzu, who was born as a 70-year-old man and a little later promotes his big idea: the wise ruler is he who does as little as possible. Brother, you said it, my God. And of course, there was Confucius.
Confucius say, girl who bathes with vinegar walk around with sour puss.
Now this guy was a laugh a minute. Probably the most famous and hilarious of all the ancient Chinese comedians, who among other things formulated an early version of the Golden Rule: never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. I gotta say, all things considered, this was a pretty good time to be a
Man from China.
What do you mean I can't say It's a man from China. A China man. Nobody minds when you say Englishmen or Frenchmen or Dutchmen or homosexual. What, I can't say that either? Oh, for Christ's sake, this. The Warring States period. But naturally, everything had to go haywire. For the next 200 years or so, the Chinese go at each other's throats, as each kingdom attempts to seize the coveted mandate of heaven from the sinking Zhou dynasty. They foolishly beat the hell out of each other for about 150 years, until the state of Qin, formerly the poorest and most backward Chinese kingdom, steamrolls everybody in a series of ghastly and horrific wars. The Qin dynasty. Although it only lasted for 20 to 30 years, the Qin dynasty might very well be the most pivotal. After conquering his rivals, the king of Qin declared himself to be the Qin Shi Huangdi, or the very first ascertainable Chinese emperor. He is probably one of the most important people in all of history. Those terracotta warriors you may have heard about, well, those were his, as was the city-sized mausoleum he had built for himself, which archaeologists are still excavating to this very day. As you can probably guess, he was also a
incorrigible reprobate
who ordered hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths building the Great Wall, and executed anybody who dared to look him in the face or even mention his name. He spent his later years searching for an elixir of life and eventually acquired the ability to live forever. Until he died. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Qin dynasty endures. It is, in a sense, responsible for the very idea of China. Although subsequent rulers would rise and fall, each of them would attempt to rebuild the politically unified, culturally homogenized empire of Qin, what in Chinese they call the Qinghua, or as we say in English, China. Ah, you see how I did that there? Now that's good writing. The Han Dynasty.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Another seminal dynasty was the Han Dynasty, and one of the few dynasties with a compelling origin story. Back during the Qin days, a local commander and sex god named Liu Bang lost track of some prisoners he was escorting to their execution. Now, under Qin law, the penalty for allowing prisoners to escape was also execution, so instead of turning himself in, Liu Bang said, "F*** it," and joined the escapees in their rebellion. I mean, what would you do? Turns out, this Liu Bang guy was a military and political genius of the highest order. He and his merry band of outlaws gathered support from the peasantry, joined up with several other rebellions, and eventually overthrew the despised Qin dynasty, probably in some great big battle. Liu Bang was then enthroned as Emperor Gaozhou. The peasants went over the moon with joy, and later that night, several lucky ladies were treated to a mandate with heaven. Liu Bang and his successors did such a good job that to this day most Chinese refer to their ethnicity as Han Chinese. So there you go. The Three Kingdoms. But the good times didn't last and the Han Dynasty eventually crumbles. This time into three big chunks. The Northern Kingdom of Wei, the Western Kingdom of Shu, and the Eastern Kingdom of Wu. A brilliant military and political leader known as Cao Cao, the Bill Clinton of classical China, attempts to subdue the two southern kingdoms but is defeated at the legendary Battle of the Red Cliffs. Later the subject matter for a rather shitty Chinese film.
I'm going to say this again. I did not
attempt to conquer China.
Indeed, I did.
Attempt to conquer China.
I did not.
Indeed, I did.
And then he apologized like a little baby.
The Jin Dynasty, the 16 Kingdoms, the Northern and Southern Dynasties, more civil wars, great sorrow, lots of death, lucky numbers 3, 17, 82, 45. The Sui Dynasty.
Come on, pig!
Finally, China pulls herself back together. Although short-lived, the Sui emperors accomplished a number of good things. They constructed the Grand Canal, repaired the Great Wall, and also attempted to conquer Korea until they got their asses handed to them. Still, they laid the groundwork for the Tang Dynasty, perhaps the high watermark of Chinese civilization. Under the Tang Dynasty, China's territory greatly expanded, the perennial barbarian menace was pushed back or bribed off, invention and poetry flourished, and they even found the time to trot out a novel experiment in emperorship. A woman. Yes, there was one, and only one, Empress of China. Her name was Wu Zetian, and like all great women in history, she began her life as a prostitute.
One who performs sexual acts in exchange for money.
No, I don't know why that is. It just seems to be the case. In a long and fascinating tale of palace intrigue that would make for a splendid HBO miniseries in case anyone over there is watching this, Wu Zetian rose from lowly concubine to royal consort to Empress Dowager and finally to Empress Regnant, and woe to anyone who underestimated her. This bitch took no prisoners. She had no qualms whatsoever about murdering or exiling her own children, and would sleep with any man or woman who could advance her quest for absolute power.
Me so horny.
In all the annals of Chinese history, and there are lots of those, no female has shown such guile, such cunning, such cruel and remorseless focus than the formidable Wu Zetian, with the possible exception of Mrs. Wong, who does my dry cleaning. Frankly, she terrifies me. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, self-explanatory. The Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was notable for being the first dynasty to relocate to southern China. Had a pretty good run there until they were utterly flattened by the Mongols. The Yuan Dynasty. These would be the Mongols. Basically the medieval Asian equivalent of lunatic American rednecks. Famous for moving the capital back north to Peking, where it has been ever since. Also attempted to invade Japan, but were thwarted when a sudden typhoon, or kamikaze, sank all their ships. More on them later. The Ming Dynasty. Famous for making priceless vases that tend to shatter in any number of highly amusing ways. Also famous for the explorations of Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who sailed the high seas in these enormous treasure ship things. Zheng made it all the way around India to East Africa and was this goddamn close from discovering the New World. But instead, in what may be the stupidest act of government ever, the Hongji Emperor forbade any further exploration and burned all of Zheng's ships. From thenceforth, the Chinese embarked on a policy of closing themselves off from the outside world. The Jin Dynasty. Didn't we already have one of those? The Qing Dynasty. This is the last of the great Chinese dynasties, and it is this dynasty that shall now concern us.
Me so horny. You keep lying. Me love you long time.
Episode 4 will be skipped because it's unlucky. Episode 5. Spring blossoms falling on summer's sword, noble falcon chase daring dragonfly. This is the Forbidden City of Peking. Built during the Ming Dynasty in the early 15th century, it became the residence of the imperial court for the remainder of the dynastic period. It was the scene of many...
Mr. O'Flannery?
What? Who said that?
I did, sir.
What's going on?
Mr. O'Flannery, I just actually had a question about the dynasties. If you don't mind?
If I don't mind. Let me understand this. You're interrupting me during a lecture.
Yeah, but I just had a question. For the Han Dynasty, I heard there was an Eastern Han and a Western Han. Is that true?
Billy, Dean's office now.
Oh, come on. I was just asking a question.
Dean's office now.
But I didn't do anything.
Dean's office now.
Oh, god damn it. Frickin' asshole.
I heard that. Don't think that just because this is previously recorded that I can't also hear you. Let me assure you, I can. Now, wonderful. I've lost my place. Okay, let's see here. Did the Yellow River, the Dynasties, Forbidden City, right. This is the Forbidden City, the palace of the Qing emperors. Now, the Qing were composed of the Manchu people, who were a bit like the Puerto Ricans of China. They loved their big flags and their cookouts, street fights and loud noises. And if you asked most Han Chinese, they'd probably say the Manchus weren't even Chinese at all. It certainly didn't help matters any that the Qing forced every man in China to get the same goddamn haircut, those long ponytail things. Chinese barbers suffered greatly. But in other respects, the Qing took on board most of the customs, standards, and practices of their predecessors. The same was also true of the Mongols, as every outside conqueror realized the only way to govern their enormous, sprawling empires was through the seemingly eternal Chinese bureaucracy. As an aside, the Chinese civil service is one of the most durable and admirable features of Chinese civilization. From at least the Han Dynasty, the Chinese deployed several meritocratic systems for choosing and promoting city officials, record keepers, civil engineers, and so on. These systems eventually coalesced into the Imperial Examination, or Keiju, an extremely difficult test meant to identify and recommend the very best scholar officials, also known as mandarins. The system worked so well that it remained in place, relatively unchanged, for over 1,000 years, the quintessential example of Chinese excellence. So the Chinese are good at test-taking, are they? Well... Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. So how about this Forbidden City thing? Apparently, it's the most expensive piece of real estate in all the world, valued at well over $70 billion. What a shame if it were to suddenly burn down. Just kidding. The Forbidden City is indeed one of the great wonders of the world, although it can be regarded as a symbol of Chinese tyranny, both past and present. I'd much prefer to marvel at its sublime craftsmanship and stately magnificence. Inside this lavish and opulent complex of halls, gardens, and pavilions lived of yore the Chinese emperors and their womenfolk. But no one else. As with the taboo of mentioning the emperor by name, no men, including the emperor's own sons, were permitted to dwell within the Forbidden City after nightfall, the only exception being the small army of eunuchs who attended the emperor's every need. Now, if you don't know what a eunuch is, go ask your parents. Wait a minute, don't do that. You're going to get me into trouble. Okay, look. The practice of castration is as old, awful, and ubiquitous as several other delightful human practices, such as slavery, torture, or infanticide, all of which the Chinese also practiced. However, few civilizations took castration quite so far as the Chinese, who not only removed the testes, but also the penis, in a process called emasculation. One might think males of all ages would be eager to avoid such a fate, but actually instances of self-castration were rather common. The pay was pretty good, I guess. I mean, this litter ain't gonna bear itself. Come on, fellas, look snappy. Chop, chop. And while we're on the topic of barbaric, inhumane practices, how about we take a look at foot binding? The whole thing got started when one emperor, Emperor Li Yu of the Tang dynasty, demanded his concubines dance on the points of their toes for his sick pleasure. Things got out of hand from there. Girls as young as 4 years old would have the bones of their feet broken, the toes curled inward, and the pathetic bleeding stumps bound in tight wrappings. From thenceforth until the end of her days, the girl could only hobble around on bovine little hooves fitted into silk slippers. Physical labor was out of the question, as was any kind of running, jumping, or dancing, even if only for her own happiness. Foot binding, along with not trimming your nails, eventually turned into a weird kind of status symbol. At its height, as many as half of all Chinese women had bound feet, and all because one goddamn emperor had a goddamn foot fetish. That's one thing I'll never understand. What the hell is the matter with you people? Feet are the part of the body furthest from the face for a reason. They are bastions of bacteria, fungi, and all manner of offending odors. Look, I get you're consenting adults and everything, but I don't have to applaud what you hobgoblins get up to in your free time. You should be ashamed of yourselves.
Hey, is he gonna puke? Is he gonna puke right now?
Now, I don't want to pick on the Chinese too much. Tight-laced corsets were just as weird and debilitating, if also far less common. But can you guess who put a stop to all this deranged nonsense? I'll tell you. American and British women. Yes, believe it or not, Western feminists were once greatly concerned about the welfare of women and girls beyond their shores. Those fuddy-duddy fillies had some wacky ideas, I tell you. Among other things, they insisted that men behave themselves, that women be educated, and that children should not be had outside of marriage. Goodness, what lunacy. Surprisingly, they were considerably less concerned about women endlessly exploring their sexuality, or opting for cosmopolitan spinsterhood as an alternative to, say, having a family and a home. I mean, since when have any women anywhere ever desired such things? And if they had, it must have been the patriarchy that put it into their heads. It's all the patriarchy, everything. It's just men. Everything's our fault, isn't it? I suppose you ladies are going to get your asses over to Somalia now and maybe put a stop to the wicked and reprehensible practice of female circumcision. No? You're just going to keep going on about all these different genders, are you? All right then, whatever you say. No, I'm listening. Please, keep talking. Episode 6. Clever fox steals hen from hen house. Lazy oxen look the other way. This is the Great Wall of China.
A big, beautiful, powerful, big, powerful, beautiful, big wall. It can have a gate, it can have a door.
Like all walls, it is a division between places. A line that marks out the contrasts between the supreme and harmonious realm of China and the barbarous and wretched realms of every place else. First constructed during the Qin dynasty, but periodically improved and strengthened by subsequent dynasties, this elaborate series of walls and fortifications stretches for thousands of miles across northern China. It was originally intended to keep out the fearsome horsemen of Central Asia who love nothing better than to storm into China and steal all her
belongings.
We're under attack! Light the signal!
Wait a minute, don't play that part yet. First, let's back up a bit. Perineum. More specifically, this is the Great Steppe, a vast sea of sparse grassland flowing endlessly across the Eurasian continent. It was here, long ago, that a great but nameless man stared at one of these things and said to himself, "You know, I bet if I jump on its back, it'll let me ride it around." And like a lot of things, everyone thought he was crazy until one day, he wasn't. Genius works like that. Anyway, the first horsemen to make an appearance in history were the charioteers. Like a bad rash spreading from the perineum, these ancient equivalents of rowdy biker gangs struck out in every direction. Some headed westwards and through a series of bloody encounters gradually transferred this new technology past the Caspian and Black Seas into Anatolia and thence to Bronze Age Assyria, Egypt, and Greece. Others, however, struck out eastward and before too long ran smack dab into the Shang dynasty, sometime around 1250 BC. This marks the beginning of China's long and turbulent relationship with those ferocious nomads beyond her borders. Like the Assyrians and the Egyptians, the Chinese readily adopted the chariot into their militaries. However, the steppe peoples always managed to stay one step ahead.
Kleptocracy. The guys who are the kleptocracy.
I know words. I have the best words.
The subsequent inventions of the saddle and the stirrup, also originating in Central Asia, allowed the riding of horses from what's known as the forward or control position. This enabled horse and rider to charge, wheel, feint, and do all those other things you see in the movies. Suddenly, chariots were very old hat. Just about every civilization with expectations of survival were trading them in for cavalry as fast as they could, and if they couldn't get any cavalry, then, well, they'd better start building walls. Now, the Chinese did have cavalry, just not particularly good cavalry. Actually, probably really shitty cavalry. But what they could do, though, and this perhaps better than any people before or since, is build walls. They walled their houses, they walled their farms, they walled their towns, they walled their cities, and it wasn't too great a leap in logic for someone to suggest, hey, why don't we just wall off the whole goddamn place? Which is what they did. The first sections of what would come to be called the Great Wall were built under the edicts of Qin Shi Huangdi sometime around 200 BC. As I have already mentioned, he was not exactly a great guy to work for. Some Chinese legends say his men were worked to the point of exhaustion, at which time they collapsed and were entombed alive within the spine of the wall, where their bones remain to this very day. Ooh, creepy. But who is this wall supposed to stop precisely? Well, it's a bit of a rogues gallery. First you had the Xiongnu people, a faction of whom may also have split off to become the Huns.
Now all of China knows you're here.
I'm afraid of gay people. I have this nightmare that I go to Hollywood and find out that Mr. T is a
Then you had the Rouran people, then the Turkic people, then the Turkic people again, and finally and most famously, the Mongols, none of which made a scrap of difference to the Chinese, who referred to all these people as Yi, or barbarians.
Get out of here, f***ing Mongolian! Don't you break down my wall!
Of course, little of the original Great Wall remains today. The Great Wall that we all know and recognize was largely constructed during the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. A popular rumor has it that the Great Wall is the only man-made structure that can be seen from outer space. But here, look at this photograph. I can't see anything, can you? Magnify. 10 times. No, still nothing. Frankly, I think this is just another instance of the Chinese grabbing their dick.
Johnson's.
Also, China, seriously, I don't see how this is supposed to work. You do know there are these things called boats, right? They could just go right around there when you're not looking. Here, I'll fix it for you. There, all finished. I mean, when you do something this crazy, you might as well go all the way with it. Now, while the Great Wall may never have been as effective or large as the Chinese would have you believe, it nonetheless reveals a unique insight into the Chinese character. To the traditional Chinese mind, China is the Middle Kingdom, occupying a place between the Upper Kingdom, or the heavens, and the Lower Kingdoms, which are all the rest of us grubby lowlifes. At times during their immensely convoluted history, especially during the Han, Tang, and Ming dynasties, the Chinese have been fairly open to the world, dispatching explorers and emissaries such as the plucky Zhang Qian to neighboring India and Persia. But at other times the Chinese have been notoriously cloistered, shrouding themselves in the pleasing and slightly salty aroma of their own flatulence. They seem to believe they could sit back forever behind their walls, their oceans, and their western deserts, untroubled by the affairs of lesser peoples, serenely convinced of their cultural and technological superiority, because obviously, what civilization could equal the majesty and splendor of the peerless Middle Kingdom? But that's not to say that some things didn't spread from China. What sort of things? Well, you remember how much fun we've been having lately. I wonder if anything like that has ever happened before. Look, China, it's called sanitation. Why don't you try it sometime? No more in garbage cans. Stop it. And what's that hanging upside down? I hope that's been thoroughly washed. Wait a minute. Just what the hell are you even eating? Now, besides devastating diseases, China also exported good things like silk. Made from the fine fibrous excretions of the diligent silkworm, probably from the anus if I had to guess, silk fabric was an instant hit. Everybody loved it, and only the Chinese could make it. Yet another instance of the fabulous prowess of the Yellow Emperor. Demand for silk was so great that an entire trading network, the eponymous Silk Road, developed to move silk westward in a series of hops. The Romans got hooked on the stuff pretty early on and passed their addiction on to their crack baby children. But it wasn't until the high Middle Ages when a handful of daring Western adventurers braved the long journey the other way. The two most famous of these are the legendary traveler Ibn Battuta and, of course, Marco. Aw, you got me. In the late 13th century, Marco Polo, only 17 years old, embarked on an extraordinary adventure throughout the Orient. Marco and his uncle and father crossed the Silk Road, mostly on foot, and eventually reached the court of the recently enthroned Yuan Emperor. This would have been that storied figure Kublai Khan, who took such a liking to young Marco he wouldn't let him leave. He kept making up excuses like, "Oh, my daughter's coming by and she really wants to meet you," or, "Hey, why don't you stay for dinner? We're getting takeout. I know this terrific place." "Go, Dragon, what's your order?" In the end, Marco Polo spent 24 years in China, having served Kublai Khan variously as an emissary and trusted courier, eventually racking up well over 1 million billion steps. That's over 15,000 miles for us normal people who prefer automobile transportation. Hey, learn how to drive. After Marco returned home to Venice, he was captured in one of those little impudent wars between Venice and Genoa. Imprisoned by the Genoese, he met, in his jail cell, the romantic writer something Italian, da Pisa, to whom he relayed his incredible story. Da Pisa took his accounts and turned them into The Travels of Marco Polo, one of the first bestsellers in the Western canon. Also, legend has it that Marco Polo introduced spaghetti to Italian cuisine, although most Italians will fight you to the death on that.
Is it true that the Chinese invented spaghetti?
Now think about it. Why would people who eat with sticks invent something that you need a fork to eat?
Episode 7. No, wait a minute, we're still on episode 6. Sorry, I must be losing it.
All men and women created by you know the thing. You know how we talk about it.
So China has a Great Wall and she has a Silk Road, and life is simply peaches and cream. Nothing could ever upend this impeccable state of affairs. Nope, nothing in the whole wide world. This is Spain, in case any of you retards
Special needs children
couldn't tell. And I'm sure at least some of you know, or at least I hope some of you know, that the Spaniards and the Portuguese went on a bit of a tear from about 1492 onwards. It all got started when the Ottomans sacked Constantinople, choking off European access to the Silk Road. They did this mainly to screw over the Christians, but they ended up screwing over themselves since the Christian kingdoms happened to have a secret weapon up their sleeves, the sailing ship. Now, it wasn't much, mind you, and I've repeatedly argued that the men who willingly got into these rickety-leaky death traps had the largest and hardest tackles of any men who ever walked the face of the earth. Yes, even harder than that. By the end of the 15th century, Spain and Portugal are shooting their loads of explorers just about all over the place, almost all of them looking for a sea route to China. Christopher Columbus stumbles across the New World and all that, but what he was really after was China, and all the goodies Europeans couldn't produce for themselves. Silk, porcelain, tea, spices. Which spices? I don't know. No one ever specifies. Just spices. Before long, these Christian maniacs make contact with the Chinese and establish a handful of trading posts on islands at the mouths of rivers, since the Qing government refused to allow any foreigners onto their territory. These would be places like Macau and what would come to be Hong Kong. The English, French, and Dutch arrive a little bit later. Now, to say the Chinese were a little touchy about all this is an understatement. Among other things, they made it a crime for anyone to teach their language to a foreigner, and adopted the posture that these bold, bearded strangers, who had traveled halfway around the world to reach them, were quite naturally their inferiors. It's a little as if space aliens landed in the middle of Central Park, and the first thing the mayor does is impound their spaceship and prosecute them for tax evasion. But perhaps we should be more understanding. For most of human history, the Chinese had been at the cutting edge of mathematics, science, engineering, architecture, economics, and medicine. Or at least, so they thought. It never occurred to anyone in the Middle Kingdom that one or more of those barbarian peoples beyond their borders might one day leap ahead of them in these respects, and it was quite a shock when this proved to be the case. A story goes that when the first British diplomat made contact with the then-reigning Qianlong Emperor, he angered the emperor by refusing to kowtow. He kneeled in the European fashion, presented the emperor with the clock and some other things, and pleaded with him to recognize the great wisdom in trading with Great Britain, to which the emperor had this to say.
Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no products within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce.
Well, f*** you too. If you ask me, the Chinese deserved what they got. The British flattened the Chinese in 2 wars called the Opium Wars, during which they seized Hong Kong and forced the Chinese to import millions of tons of soothing, relaxing opium. The French and the Japanese got in on the action a little later. The Chinese themselves have a term for this period. They call it the Century of Humiliation, and you better believe they're still sore about it. But if you think for one goddamn second the Chinese wouldn't have done the exact same thing or worse if the binding had been on the other foot, then you need to go back and do the reading. Better still, go to any small country town, find the local Denny's and ask yourself, where are all these drugs coming from? Episode 7. Ill-tempered donkey kick wall of house, bang boom, everything fall down. This is the Bund of Shanghai, once the largest and most important of the several foreign quarters conceded by the Qing dynasty during the Century of Humiliation. Western merchants and dignitaries set up shop here, and even worse, as far as the Qing were concerned, were the Christian missionaries who roamed hither and thither across the countryside, banning foot binding, teaching English, and proclaiming the Gospels, which had a few, shall we say, unforeseen consequences. In 1843, a failed imperial bureaucrat named Hong Zhiquan read one of those Christian pamphlets that were floating around and reached the perfectly sane and reasonable conclusion that he was the younger brother of Jesus. Yes, that Jesus. Furthermore, Hong decided it was his mission in life to rid China of the false Qing emperors and the devil-worshipping Confucians. Realizing their mistake, American missionaries scrambled to dissuade young Hong from his plans of violent insurrection, but to little avail. His movement rapidly gained supporters who may not have believed everything he said, but who certainly had an axe to grind against the corrupt Qing authorities. It must be remembered that the Qing were not ethnically Han Chinese, so we can throw a bit of bigotry in there as well. For the next 20 years or so, the Taiping Rebellion, as it became known, raged across China. For comparison's sake, around the same time, the United States was fighting its own civil war in which nearly 500,000 young men lost their lives. In China, 20 to 30 million people lost their lives. It is often considered the bloodiest civil war in all of history, and almost no one, including myself to my great shame, knows very much about it. The Qing dynasty never really recovered from this awful catastrophe. Many, understandably, blamed the foreigners for provoking this turmoil, and at the end of the century another rebellion broke out, the Boxer Rebellion. This time, a group calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists decided to rid China of all foreign influence through the use of Kung Fu. Among other things, these guys believed their magical inner life force, or Qi, would enable them to bounce artillery shells off their stomachs, catch bullets in their teeth, and defeat a professionally trained modern army with their fruity little punches and kicks. As you might imagine, this did not end particularly well. The Qing court vacillated on whether or not to support the Boxers, but once they began murdering the diplomats of that most humane and tolerant people, the Germans, the jig was up.
3 times over, boy.
An 8-nation alliance, including the United States and Japan, teamed up to wax the floor with these delusional Chinamen.
Men from China.
In yet another humiliating contretemps. Now, the Qing court did attempt to negotiate its way out of the situation, yet throughout all its dealings with the West, it was hampered by a political tradition that had long ago calcified and grown brittle. The Qing dynasty were attempting to hold together a sprawling empire under tremendous internal and external pressure, with a state apparatus relatively unchanged since the days of the Tang Dynasty. Frankly, it's astonishing they clung on to power for as long as they did.
Where are your ancestors buried?
In Scotland, Your Majesty.
But then, where's your skirt?
This is Puyi, the very last Chinese emperor. And that's it, that's all you need to know. A far more interesting person, however, is his grandmother, Empress Dowager Cixi. For well over 40 years, this tiny, shrewd, clawed woman had been calling all the shots in China. When her useless and pathetic son complained that he, as emperor, ought to be running the show, Cixi had him locked up in his room with his concubines. Not unlike that dream I had when I was a little boy.
Thank you, God!
Cixi attempted to chart a middle course between reform and tradition. She bade her ministers to embark on all these comedic attempts to modernize. First, they created a new army modeled on Western lines that they called the New Army. But then some bureaucrat misplaced it, so they had to create a whole new army, this one called the Beiyang Army. Of course, they created a Beiyang fleet to go along with it, and also a Nanyang fleet, and a Guangdong fleet, and a Fujian fleet, all of which were almost totally annihilated by the French. Well, I'll be damned. The French actually won a naval engagement. Good for you.
Tu viens nous parler comme de la merde? Bah oui. Mais t'es qui pour me parler comme ça, toi? Putain, t'es qui pour me parler comme ça, toi?
By the way, Bei in Chinese simply means north. So Beijing, although I'm going to keep calling it Peking for personal reasons, simply means North City. There's a lot of places in China named that way. The province of Hebei means north of the river. The province of Hubei means north of the lake. The province of Hunan means south of the lake. And the province of Fuyu means exactly what you think it means. These are historical.
Shut the f*** up.
Just about everybody was picking on China in those days. The nation of Japan, formerly China's scrawny kid brother, had hit the gym hard and turned into one of those roid-rage psychopaths. The Japanese took over from the French and pummeled China mercilessly in the First Sino-Japanese War. Something had to give way. And in 1911, that thing was the Wuchang Uprising. It was really one of several uprisings that had broken out across China in the wake of the failed Boxer Rebellion. However, it was undoubtedly the most successful. After a railway dispute provoked the regional garrison to march on the city of Wuchang, revolutionaries seized control of the city and declared the surrounding province to be a republic. Further revolts spread like wildfire in nearly every province and major city of China. The revolutionaries themselves were something of a motley crew. Oh, for Christ's sake, knock it off. That's not even funny. Some, like the Taiping rebels before them, dreamed of driving out the hated Manchus and founding a new dynasty pronouncedly Han in ethnicity. Others, like the Boxers, were mostly concerned with eliminating the nefarious influence of the dastardly barbarians who had come from across the sea. And still there were more others, a loose collection of oddballs, patriots, dreamers, and visionaries who had imbibed the lessons of the West and wished to apply these legal and political theories to their homeland. As a rule, they were young, dashing, well-traveled, open-minded enough to appreciate the advantages of Western-style governance, yet fired by that genuine ardor for the country that distinguishes an honest statesman. And it is really their story, their early cooperation and then their tragic disunion, that this lecture is all about. And of these revolutionaries, there would be one man, above all, who would rise to be called the father of his nation. Episode 8. Man on proud steed bring heavenly promise to suffering people. This is Sun Yat-sen. Wait a minute, that's not Sun Yat-sen. Who's been f***ing around with my notes? He was a man of contrasts, a man of thought, and a man of action. He is to China what Benjamin Franklin is to the United States, a guiding beacon in a time of uncertain transformation. Handsome, adventurous, intelligent, and determined, his whirlwind of a life would come to be revered, not only by the later nationalists, but also the communists, each of whom felt the other had betrayed Sun's vision. He was born in 1866 in a small village in the southern Canton province, now Guangdong province. His older brother had already emigrated from China, landing in Hawaii of all places, and Sun followed him there for his schooling. As it turns out, the Kingdom of Hawaii was just then in the midst of being annexed by the United States, so, owing to a stroke of luck, Sun became a naturalized American citizen. Hey, how about that? He also converted to Christianity, much to the displeasure of his family, yet the connections he forged among the Chinese Christians afforded him a plethora of hiding places and escape routes, many of which would later come in handy. Trained as a physician, Sun grew dissatisfied with Chinese medicine and thereafter turned his healing touch to the grave maladies afflicting his country. By the way, that reminds me, I've got this, this terrific Chinese doctor joke, and, let's get through the lecture, and maybe I'll share it with you. You'll love it. It's really quite something. Sun began moving in revolutionary circles, sometimes leading local uprisings, all of which failed, and other times traveling abroad to raise funds for his revolutionary pals. He solicited donations from Chinese expatriates, as well as foreign sympathizers, in places like London, Tokyo, and across the United States. He also found the time to take no fewer than 2 wives and 3 concubines, which sounds like such a goddamn headache, I don't know how he managed it. Did you hear that, Gladys? Anyway, when word reached him of the Wu Chang uprising, Sun cut short his stay in Denver, Colorado, and rushed back to China, bringing along American adventurer General Homer Lee in his luggage. Do we have time to do a quick sidebar on Homer Lee? No? Okay, I guess we do. Now, there's another guy we should probably talk about, General Yuan Shikai, the leader of the powerful Beiyang army. Like Sun Yat-sen, Yuan Shikai was also a bigamist who had 32 children spread out over 10 different women.
You need to be a dad! You need to be a dad!
You are not!
Stop that!
So what happens? Well, it's a little hard to follow. The Qing court recalls General Shikai from retirement, grants him all these titles and honors and things, and begs him to quell the Wu Chang and related uprisings. The wily Shikai agrees, but then takes his sweet time with everything. He crushes one rebellion in
Hankou and Hanyang, now all part of Wuhan.
Where have I heard that name before? But declines to march on Wu Chang, spotting an opportunity for parley. By this time, Sun Yat-sen is back in China. He organizes the disparate uprisings into a unified provisional government and is elected as its first president. However, Sun recognizes the hopeless military situation of the revolutionaries and opts to negotiate with Shikai instead. The two characters eventually hammer out a compromise. Sun will yield the presidency of the new Republic of China to Shikai if Shikai will use his influence to convince the Qing court to abdicate. With almost no supporters left anywhere in China, the Qing court agrees to Shikai's demands. And so, on February 14th, 1912, Valentine's Day, roughly 4,000 years of Chinese dynastic rule came to a sudden and anticlimactic end. They even let Pu Yi stay in the Forbidden City to play emperor for another 10 years or so. I don't know if they forgot to tell him he'd been deposed or what, but you know, there's a lot worse ways this could have gone, so I suppose we should be thankful. Sun Yat-sen and his lieutenants next organized the first national elections in Chinese history. It was a bit of a mess, somewhat understandably, but in the end, 120 delegates met at the First National Assembly in Peking, under the leadership of Premier Song Jiaren and his newly minted political party, the Kuomintang. But then, in the most predictable thing ever, President Shikai assassinates Song Jiaren and promptly declares himself to be the Emperor of China. And since he's dissolving elected bodies and just making shit up, the military governors he'd appointed all follow suit, seizing control of the provinces to rule as semi-autonomous warlords. Sun Yat-sen flees to Japan, the Kuomintang attempts a second revolution which fails, and China descends into chaos yet again. And that's it. That's the story of the 1911 revolution, also called the Zhenhai Revolution. Pretty dismal stuff. The only good thing to come out of it was this flag. I've got to say, I really love this flag. Think about how much cooler China would seem if they just stuck with this flag. It's got all these neat colors on it, colors you don't usually see on flags. In case you want to know, it's called the 5 Races Under One Union flag. The red represents the Han, the yellow represents the Manchus, the blue represents the Mongols, the white represents the Muslims, and the black represents the Tibetans, who are the only Oriental people you'll ever meet who can have red hair and blue eyes. Very spicy. Episode 9. Ancient dragon forget he leave door unlocked. Cunning rat steal much treasure. China was f***ed. They had no real government, warlords ruled the provinces, and in 1916, after the death of the so-called Emperor Shikai, you could barely even call them a nation. Somebody, this guy I guess, attempted to restore Puyi back to the throne, but no one bought a ticket to that dog and pony show. Sun Yat-sen returned from exile and managed to establish a toehold back in Canton province, hoping to build a base from which future patriots might rescue their broken, bleeding country. Meanwhile, the European powers, who might have been counted on to broker some sort of transitional government, were busy with the little thing that was going on in Europe at the time. Also, China's massive neighbor to the north was enduring her own internal and quite ridiculous turmoil, which meant nobody was really paying much attention when another power in Asia decided the time was ripe to play their hand. This is Japan. They are a nation of colorful two-dimensional cartoon people who perambulate with extraordinarily fluid movements and contemporarily increase their power levels to stupefying magnitudes. Their literature is unfathomable, their cuisine and pornography are tentacle-based,
exploding milk porn.
And yet, unlike China, their modernization program was a paragon of success. Back in 1905, Japan had bested the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. As a result, they acquired the Korean Peninsula as well as territories in Manchuria, whetting an appetite that would fuel her gradual expansion into China proper. During World War I, Japan joined the Allies for the most piratical of reasons and cruised about the Pacific, seizing practically unguarded German assets. As an aside, many of these places would 30 years later have to be retaken at terrible cost by American sailors, soldiers, and Marines. China could do nothing to stop any of this. Her century of humiliation had grown somehow even more humiliating. The regional warlords, as warlords do, plotted and schemed against one another in a state of affairs eerily similar to the warring states period of ancient China. The average
man from China
in the street could therefore be forgiven for concluding that what China needed was a second Qin Shi Huangdi to unify her once again. But where could such a man be found? Ultimately, there would emerge 2 candidates. This is Chiang Kai-shek. Or is it? No, wait, I'm wrong this time. This is Chiang Kai-shek. I just kind of like saying Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek. Born in Zhejiang province to a modest family and widowed mother, Chiang was, in his youth, something of a problem child, which may be why his mother sent him away to military school in Japan at the nearest opportunity. And if it weren't for Gladys's infernal meddling, you better believe military school is just what my son would have gotten. Maybe then I could look him in the face without feeling an irresistible urge to shoot myself. What kind of grown man collects something called Funko Pops? Still, he's nowhere near as embarrassing as my nephew. You may have even heard of him. He ran off to California a few years ago, finagled his way into Congress, and recently found himself honeypotted by a Chinese man-eater. Oh, the indignity. She isn't even all that pretty. I mean, I might have forgiven him if she was some kind of femme fatale, but as it is, maybe it's just because, to me, all Chinese women look like Matter of fact, there was this one lady I knew who... And that's why I could never go back to that particular library. So, where was I? Oh yes, Chiang Kai-shek. After his schooling, Chiang returned home just in time to participate in the Wu-Chang uprising. When the first Kuomintang collapsed, he fled for Shanghai and for a time fell in with the notorious Green Gang, one of China's surprisingly numerous organized crime syndicates.
You hear about the Chinese Godfather? He made them an offer they couldn't understand.
Long story short, Chiang eventually found his way to the southern metropolis of Guangzhou, where Sun Yat-sen was painstakingly rebuilding the Kuomintang back into an effective organization. He also sought once more foreign aid, especially in the form of military equipment and expertise, to prepare for an eventual campaign to reunify the country. But time, it seemed, was catching up to him. And just as he was casting his eyes around for a confident and energetic successor, preferably one with a military background, who should turn up but Chiang Kai-shek? There's a bit more to the story, but as sometimes happens, the hyper-ambitious younger man and the wise but weary older man forged a close friendship. In order to ingratiate himself further with his mentor, Chiang courted and married Sun's sister-in-law, Sung Mei-ling. However, as a devout Christian, Sung insisted that Chiang first divorce his current wife and all his concubines, to which Chiang said, "Sure, baby, whatever." In any case, the trick worked. Chiang slid into the role of Sun's protege, rivaled only by a man called Wang Jingwei, who headed up the left-leaning socialist-minded faction of Sun's broad coalition. You see, in those days, the Kuomintang was something of a dirty farrago comprising illiberal nationalist modernizers, illiberal socialist modernizers, illiberal communist psychopaths, and anyone else who wished to unify the country under some sort of supreme central authority. The genuinely moderate voices in the Kuomintang were few and far between, although it may be here worthwhile to posit a little counterfactual. There were some, most notably Chen Zhongming, the military governor of Guangdong province, who advocated in favor of a federated Chinese republic. In his scheme, the provinces would first assert their sovereignty as independent states, and, over a period of years, gradually join into a union of provinces, which would then form a limited central government to manage the affairs of the nation as a whole. Sound familiar? Wouldn't it have been nice if that's what they did? Federalism probably doesn't work for every country, but it tends to work pretty well for large ethnically or regionally diverse places like, China. But remember, the notion of an all-powerful centralized state was such an inseparable and fundamental component of Chinese identity, the leading revolutionaries could comprehend no other form of political organization. There had also never been, except in a few places in the South, anything approximating a liberal tradition. In industrious commercial tradition, sure, but that's not quite the same thing. As I've grown older and hopefully wiser, I've come to believe that all peoples across the world value more or less the same set of things. No people I know of regard idleness as a virtue, with the possible exception of the Welsh, and differences between peoples more often involve differences in priority rather than differences in kind. For instance, Aristotle claimed courage was the greatest of all virtues, for without courage the other virtues could never be maintained. Tokugawa Ieyasu, on the other hand, might have said patience was the most important, and good old Al-Ghazali might have put forward obedience. But in case any of you youngsters are wondering, here is the final correct list. The same holds true with social goods. In the Chinese constellation of values, liberty is a nice thing to have, but not nearly as important as something else: harmony. 100 million mouths speaking with one voice, 100 million bodies moving with one purpose. The Chinese get off on that for reasons incomprehensible to me. Americans, of course, go in the exact opposite direction. That is to say, all real Americans. Harmony is certainly something we value. We do have to live together somehow or another. But when it comes at the expense of individual freedom, then, well, harmony. You can stick that goddamn bullshit straight up your ass, you goddamn commies. No, I'm not putting on any more of your f***ing masks. Suck my balls. I hope you choke on them too. Stop telling me what to do. At any rate, I hope this sheds a little light on Chiang Kai-shek's conception of his country. He was the quintessential nationalist. Above all things, he wished to reunify China under his rule, of course, and maybe later introduce a few democratic reforms or what have you. He was vehemently opposed to communism, but only in the sense that communists were dangerous rivals in his quest for absolute control. As for communism itself, I openly wonder if he could have even explained what it was.
May I introduce to the audience the President of the National Government of the Republic of China. Long live the Three People's Principle. Long live the revolutionary spirit of the nationalist China.
In 1925, an ailing Sun Yat-sen dies from cancer of the gallbladder, that most capricious of the bladders, and he is greatly mourned. Predictably, a power struggle breaks out in which Chiang Kai-shek emerges victorious, and the following year he launches his mentor's long-awaited Northern Expedition. At first, all goes well. The newly minted National Revolutionary Army splits into 3 columns and easily sweeps aside the demoralized forces of the local warlords. The National Revolutionary Army is also relatively well equipped, thanks in no small part to the help of an unlikely ally, the Soviet Union. A few years earlier, Sun Yat-sen had traveled to Moscow and established a rapport with Vladimir Lenin, of all people. Stalin retained Lenin's policy of supporting the Kuomintang and not the communists, for reasons that are still mysterious to everyone. I think Stalin's game here was to first help the nationalists secure the country, and a little later shamelessly betray them. Anyway, we'll never find out because Wang Jingwei, leading the Western column, seized the city of Wuhan and peremptorily declared China to be a socialist republic. Chiang, who had just captured the city of Nanking, responded by carrying out a purge of local communists and instituting a policy of white terror. No, not that kind of white terror. This kind of white terror, which was really so much worse. In the year 1927, according to some estimates, nearly 300,000 Chinese lost their lives to anti-communist repression. Chiang himself is reported to have said, "I would rather kill 1,000 innocent people by accident than let one communist escape." Jesus Christ.
Somebody had to do it.
So that was one candidate for the Emperor's old clothes. But I did say there was another, didn't I? A most amiable and upstanding sort of fellow, jolly and good-natured and not fanatical in any way. In a pig's eye. Now, do you youngsters notice? That's called comedy. That's called sarcasm. Episode 10. Beautiful cock, rise early in morning, always point a little to the left. This is Mao Zedong. No, goddammit, now you're doing this on purpose. Put the real Mao up there. Now this is Mao Zedong. And this is Mao Zedong when he was just a little boy. Born in 1893 to a wealthy landholding family in Hunan province, there really isn't too much to say about his childhood except he abandoned his first wife, the result of an arranged marriage. Like almost all communist revolutionaries, Mao had a long history of abandoning women, avoiding work, dropping out of school, and composing god-awful, oleaginous poetry.
Here I stand on rolling hill. Distant sunset, crimson gleam. In the air, falcon cry. Caw, 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 caw. Is a wind with a cold frost. Make you have a cold. A flu, make a sneeze. A chew, rising moon, make a sleep. Make a dream of communism.
Reminds me of a couple of other clowns from a few years back. Apparently, contemporaries attest that he was handsome. Okay, whatever you say. And this, along with his undeniable intelligence, enabled him to swiftly rise through the ranks of whatever cockamamie commie outfit he happened to join. What were the communists doing in China? Well, what weren't they doing? The dawn of European involvement in China unfortunately coincided with the creation and dissemination of some real grade-A European
bovine excrement.
Those of you who attended my previous seminar will be familiar with my critique of Marxism, but for those of you who foolishly squandered the opportunity, here is a brief recapitulation. Dialectic, balderdash, historical materialism, balderdash, communist manifesto, balderdash, socialism, balderdash, sexual robots, balderdash.
Number 8.
Borgosio, balderdash, proletariat, balderdash, class struggle, balderdash, revolution, balderdash, communism, balderdash, hot gay sex. All I can say is, I hope you rot in hell. So there you go. By the 1920s, Mao was loitering around Peking, sometimes attending classes at Peking University, and other times attending secret meetings, distributing pamphlets, or participating in student protests. Your standard run-of-the-mill pinko crap.
A bum. That's what he is. A bum.
He eventually moved back home, took a post as a history teacher, and at some point joined the newly founded Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. On the advice of the Soviets, the early Chinese communists allied themselves with the Kuomintang and played for time. Mao, as one of the CCP's rising stars, was thus brought into contact with the Kuomintang leadership. He may even have met Sun Yat-sen before the latter's death, though this is disputed. Regardless, the shotgun marriage between the communists and the nationalists was always bound for heartbreak. Of course, it didn't help that after the Northern Expedition petered out, Chiang Kai-shek put on a bunch of crazy clothes and probably lost his mind.
I think you better pull the trigger.
This was the beginning of his Generalissimo period, which unlike David Bowie's glam period or Lady Gaga's sex-crazed supervillain period, did not cause me to lose my faith in God.
He's right, you know.
As mentioned, the Kuomintang leftists turned on Chiang, who responded by massacring them and driving the survivors into the hinterlands. The CCP belatedly formed its own Red Army to oppose Chiang and, for some reason, appointed Mao as its first commander, despite the fact he had no military experience of any kind. Mao's first plan was to seize the city of Changsha, from which he might build up a base to strike at Chiang and his National Revolutionary Army. Not a bad plan, but his clumsy attack faltered in an event known as the Autumn Harvest Uprising. As a result, Mao retreated with his battered army into the rough highlands of the Jing'an Mountains, whereupon the communist leadership, currently hiding out in Shanghai, expelled him from the party. Oh, why couldn't you have just killed him? It would have been so easy. Just sprinkle some arsenic into his Rice Krispie squares, or pour Drano in his Kool-Aid. I don't care, you had options is what I'm saying. Anyway, defeated in the field, booted out of his own party, with no support from foreign powers, not even the Soviet Union, which didn't think much of Mao either, stranded in the remote wilderness with a ragtag army numbering at most in the hundreds, thus it was that Mao Zedong showed something special. Whatever else one might say about him, that he was a mass-murdering tyrant, that he was a communist lunatic, that he was in his old age a decrepit and lecherous fiend, no one can deny that in his younger days, Mao Zedong was as tenacious and indefatigable as any man who ever lived. Unlikely though it may seem, it was from such desperate circumstances that Mao began his long ascent to power. All along, his central insight was sound. Mao insisted that the Bolshevik playbook simply would not work in China. Unlike the Bolsheviks, who had been strongest in the cities, the Chinese communists were naturally strongest in the countryside, where the destitute peasants had a long list of complaints on a good day. Yet these ideas cut against the grain of Marxist theory, which held that the revolution would be led by industrial workers, of which there were next to none in China, and this heresy was probably the real reason for his expulsion from the CCP. And yet, if Mao was right about anything in the entirety of his cruel and wicked life, he was right about this. Mao's special gift, or one of them anyway, was to whip up these angry, mistreated peasants into a bloodthirsty frenzy. Rebuffed by his fellow communists, Mao was now beyond the influence of either Shanghai or Moscow. Safely ensconced in Nanking and busy trying on new clothes, Chiang Kai-shek had not the slightest inkling that his wrathful repression had inadvertently spawned a dangerous and mortal enemy. And now, the fat was in the fire.
Oh, oh, I don't know what to do, guys. I don't know what to do.
Put a lid on it, dummy. Episode 11. Arrogant crane lose balance in storm. Mischievous monkey fling poo from own ass. This is Peking, a city of contrasts. A city of brutally ugly, austere buildings, filled with brutally ugly, austere plutocrats and their sinister, sycophantic minions. Wait, that's not Peking. That's Washington, D.C. Ah, I see what you did there. Very good.
Clever girl.
Not that you care or anything, but Peking was once known as Dadu, or Winter Palace, in juxtaposition to Xanadu, or Summer Palace, for the filthy Mongol Khans of the Yuan dynasty. When the Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongols, they renamed it to Peking, or Northern Capital, to distinguish it from the southern stronghold of Nanking, or Southern Capital. Both Peking and Nanking belong to that special club known as the Four Great Ancient Capitals of China. The other two being Chang'an, now known as Jian, and Luoyang, the latter cities having been occupied since at least the days of the Zhao dynasty. Now, to a man like Chiang Kai-shek, control of these four cities meant legitimacy in his bid to rule all of China. He had Nanking, now he needed Peking. So, in 1928, the Generalissimo cut a deal with the northern warlords and secured the city. The details are sketchy at best, but I'd like to think it involved copious amounts of coke, hookers, and pirated DVDs of Nicolas Cage movies.
Ever heard of a line?
Hey, have you ever been dragged to the sidewalk and beat until you pissed blood?
However, when the warlords discovered their DVDs were region-locked, they became enraged, banded together, and fought Chiang in something called the Central Plains War, piling up another 250,000 Chinese corpses. In the end, Chiang quashed the rebellion, but his troubles were far from over. In 1931, the Japanese, who had been slowly infiltrating Manchuria for decades, finally invaded outright. They pacified Manchuria with relative ease and installed the former child emperor Pu Yi, remember him, as the titular head of a new puppet state they called Manchukuo. Any of you going to complain about colonization or something? I'm certain at least one of you will decry this instance of naked imperialism. Or what about the periodic Chinese attempts to conquer Vietnam, or Korea, or Tibet? I'll just pause here a moment. Any minute now. I'll keep waiting. Chiang Kai-shek knew his position was far too weak vis-a-vis Japan, so he concentrated on strengthening his army, defeating or bribing the remaining warlords, and finally catching up with those pesky communists who were somewhere in the, wait a minute, where were they? You, communists, come out, whatever you are. Oh, there you are. Still hiding out in the mountains, Mao Zedong's tiny fanatical Red Army was proving to be a very nasty thorn in the Generalissimo's balls. They were little more than rough bandits during those lean years, sallying forth from their hidey holes to harass nationalist forces, steal food and equipment, and recruit new soldiers. Slowly but surely, Mao molded his peasant minions into a disciplined guerrilla force, simultaneously filling their small, simple minds with Marxist hokum. Naturally, the Kuomintang tried to smother this baby in the crib. My God, that's a distressing metaphor. The nationalist forces surround the communists in no less than 5 encirclement campaigns, the last one personally commanded by Chiang Kai-shek himself. Surrounded, hopelessly outnumbered, and starving to death, Mao decided to risk everything on one desperate gamble. He gathered somewhere around 80,000 soldiers, broke through the nationalist lines under the cover of darkness, and fled deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind several thousand wounded and a significant number of women and children, most of whom would not live to see another day. Thus began what became known as the Long March, sometimes regarded as the greatest retreat in all of military history. For an entire year, the Red Army trudged along winding muddy roads, up and over the backs of mountains, under beating sun and through driving rain, pursued continuously by nationalist armies twice their size, fending off attacks by hostile tribesmen of various ethnicities who, after all these years, still remained beyond the wall, so to speak, of Chinese civilization. But it was all balderdash, outright bunk, made up by later communist propagandists. In reality, Chiang allowed the communists to escape in order to please the Soviets, who were still supporting him militarily. The Soviets, for their part, preferred the communists relocate further north, ostensibly to better control them. Mao himself was nearly left behind and was literally carried by his men for most of the trip. Along the way, perhaps to ease the stress that comes with being a brilliant revolutionary genius, Mao began a love affair with a 20-year-old admirer named Jiang Qing. This would have been heartwarming had Mao not already been married to He Zhizhen, the mother of his 6 children.
Danny, 2's great, but 3's a crowd.
Obviously, one of those 2 things had to go, and Mao graciously had his wife committed to a mental institution in the Soviet Union. Look, I know we've all thought about it, but really, have a heart, Mao. For purposes of keeping score of Mao's 4 official wives, wife number 1 he abandoned and committed
self-deletion.
Wife number 2 he abandoned and was executed by the Kuomintang. Wife number 3 he clapped in the loony bin on false pretenses, and wife number 4 remained devoted to him throughout the remainder of his life, even as he routinely cheated on her with underage girls. These are historical facts. In October 1935, Mao and his depleted Red Army finally reached the western province of, this word, the new base of operations. By then, thanks mainly to desertion, their numbers had dwindled to somewhere around 4,000 soldiers, which somewhat defeats the point of retreating in the first place. Was the Long March simply a ploy by Mao to personally escape capture? Yes. Yes, it was. And soon Mao was back at his old game, dangling fabulous promises before poor illiterate peasants, convincing them they would one day share in a glorious paradise before sending them to their sad and unremembered deaths. The target of his raids this time was not the Kuomintang but the Japanese, who were doing their own raiding into China and would soon become an existential threat. And now, everything I just said, translated for Zoomers. What up, fam? No cap, CKS looking all sus with that aggro drip. On guard, he simpin' for Western powers, brah. MZD bussin', vibin' at his crib, brah. MZD just sippin' tea, finna get the squad up and cancel CKS, no cap. CKS be big mad Lamau. That's a yikes. MZD just hit different, brah. You feel some bars he write, they slap. He the real goat, brah. Jesus Christ, we're Episode 12. Fiery comet burn hole in sky. Jade Emperor frown with sadness. Now just wrap your mind around how crazy all this is. There are something like 8 civil wars going on at once, all stacked on top of each other. The Kuomintang are fighting the communists, who are fighting the Japanese, who are fighting the warlords, who are fighting the Kuomintang, who are also fighting the Japanese, who are also fighting the warlords, and at one point the Russians show up too, because why the hell not? It was hard to say who's on whose side at any given moment. Case in point,
the Xi'an incident.
Then there happens one of those episodes that sound as if they were written in the book of make-believe. And again, we have no photographs because no one invites a photographer to witness a kidnapping, which was what happened next.
One day, Chiang Kai-shek flies into a conference with his generals, only to be kidnapped by his subordinate Zhang something unpronounceable, who then tries to persuade him to join with the communists. Zhang's idea was that the Kuomintang and the Red Army should unify to oppose the Japanese together, which, given the circumstances, was not a bad plan. But don't ask me why he thought any of this would work. Mao Zedong and the Generalissimo were 2 of the most stubborn queens who ever lived.
Bro, you had rolls all over the place in the back. It was disgusting.
The off. I've had it with you. Go the home.
Chiang averred he'd support Zhang's proposal, but once he was safely back at headquarters, he had all the conspirators arrested and most put to death. That was the
Xi'an
incident, but there were other incidents. For whatever reason, Chinese history is full of incidents. Like the Mukden incident, contrived by Japan to justify their invasion of Manchuria, or this one, the Marco Bridge incident, also contrived by Japan, also to justify invasion.
The first thing the Japs did was to prepare their usual fake alibi. This time it wasn't a damaged railway track, as it had been in Manchuria in 1931. A Jap soldier had disappeared. Obviously he'd been kidnapped by the insolent Chinese. Once more, Japan's honor had been insulted. Once more, the insult must be avenged. So, on the night of July 7th, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking, the Jap war machine struck.
In 1937, the Japanese Kwantung Army, not to be confused with the Chinese Kuomintang Army, poured across the Manchuria border and into the Chinese heartland. This is remembered in China as the Second Sino-Japanese War. We in the West tend to think of it as the prologue to World War II, although by either designation it was a brutal, murderous calamity. Japan had been nipping at the flanks of China for the better part of a century. but now she went whole hog, rampaging across the northern and central provinces until the Generalissimo ordered the dams and dikes of the Yellow River to be destroyed. This resulted in a massive flood, which caused the deaths of upwards of 500,000 people, mainly Chinese civilians. Meanwhile, Japanese forces invested the city of Shanghai from the sea. Chiang dispatched several of his crack divisions to defend the city, but the thing turned into a Chinese fire drill. Chinese pilots tended to miss their targets wildly, and in one instance bombed their own refugee camp. Chinese infantry were woefully outgunned by the far more powerful Japanese, and resorted to house-to-house fighting, incurring frightful casualties. Actually, I'm not giving Chiang's troops nearly enough credit. On the whole, they fought ferociously, if amateurly. There were a few standouts, however, including a number of volunteer American pilots, all of Chinese ancestry. Men like Arthur Chin, who is now recognized as the first American fighter ace of the war, and who afterwards worked quietly as a mailman in Oregon until his death in 1997. All honor to a brave man. Nevertheless, the situation was hopeless. The Kuomintang had few airplanes or tanks, old outdated weapons in general, and no industrial base with which to produce more. Seeing the writing on the wall, Chiang pulled his forces back to the neighboring city of Nanking. Nanking was then also besieged and captured, resulting in the hideous
non-consensual sex act
of Nanking. Now think about how awful you have to behave in order for a
member of a disbanded political party
to emerge as the hero of the story. John Rabe, a German businessman and staunch
member of a disbanded political party,
established something called the Nanking Safety Zone, an agreement among foreign embassies to shelter the panic-stricken Nanking civilians. By some estimates, his efforts preserved the lives of 250,000 people. Yet those beyond the safety zone could only watch in gaping horror as a nightmare of unprecedented proportions descended upon their fair city. The Japanese soldiers, contaminated by years of social conditioning and enraged at the stubborn defense put up by Chiang's troops, took what they saw as their revenge on the local population. The accounts are harrowing. The Japanese commanders did not even try to put a halt to the violence, and in many cases, fervently encouraged it. However, it quickly became clear to the Japanese authorities that this reign of terror had been a colossal blunder. Nanking was the capital of the closest thing to a government China had. It was brimming with foreigners, all of whom were appalled by the carnage and quickly informed their governments and the press. International condemnation was swift and unambiguous. The United States was distinctly outraged, and slowly but surely that earnest and mighty people began to stir themselves from their isolationist slumber. Something began to form in America that became known as the China Lobby. Present in both major parties, the China Lobby pressured the Roosevelt administration to take a harder line against Japan and to forthrightly back Chiang Kai-shek. John Wayne himself even came over with his dynamite flying tigers and would have saved China's bacon if it weren't for all those four-eyed bean counters back in Washington.
Ding Hao.
Ding Hao? Oh, wait a minute, that was just a movie I saw. But what a movie! They don't make them like this anymore. I honestly feel bad for you youngsters. You've never seen a real movie in the entirety of your short and what I assume will be pointless lives. What happened to the greats? What happened to Bogart? What happened to Hayworth? What happened to Disney?
He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil.
Aid from Uncle Sam would eventually reach Chiang, but not nearly in time and never enough. Chiang's other supposedly staunch ally, Uncle Joe, was busy flicking Japan's nose over Manchuria and then got tied up with something that happened in 1941. Also in 1941, the Roosevelt administration smacked Japan with an oil embargo in an attempt to dissuade her from further conquest. I remember because that was the summer I got my first erection as I watched my neighbor Mrs. Putnam hang her laundry out to dry. I don't know why I'm telling you this, but screw it. If nothing else, it adds a little color. Now, the Japanese were incensed by this. The embargo, not my stiffy. I think that's understood, since it deprived them of 95% of their oil supply, without which modern war, to say little of modern life, is utterly impossible. As it turns out, neither Japan nor China have any proven oil reserves. The only nearby source of oil is to be found in the South Asian islands of Borneo and Java, at that time under the control of the British and the Dutch. Obviously, those places would have to be invaded too, which would almost certainly bring the United States into open war with Japan. So, the Japanese hatched a scheme. In an audacious gamble, they would attempt to strike everywhere at once before the British, Dutch, Australians, and Americans could organize themselves and respond. In early December, their plans were ripe, and they metaphorically pulled the trigger.
Nice block there by Lehman. Cup still going. He's up to the 25, and now he's hit and hit hard about the 27-yard line. Bruiser Kennard made the tackle.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
This is John Daly speaking from the CBS newsroom in New York. Here is the Far East situation as reported to this moment.
The President of the United States.
The distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned. The Japanese government also launched an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
What are you waiting for? Do it!
That's right, kids. Pearl Harbor was just one of many surprise attacks, and all of them were in response to American support for China. The irony is not lost on me that American blood and treasure were spent subduing Japan in order to rescue China, only to lose China to this asshole. What a f***ing travesty. If you were to tell someone in the 1940s that in the 2020s Japan would be one of our closest friends and allies, whereas China would be our fiercest rival and competitor, they would have laughed you out the room, which just goes to show how clueless the State Department and the press were even back in those days. None of those h***s took the threat of communism as seriously as they should, possibly because many of them found communists to be heroic or at the very least sympathetic figures. And just what was Mao up to anyway? Well, he and his Red Army were enjoying a rather relaxing, rather pleasant kind of war. I'm not saying they were completely on the sidelines, but, well, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Mao was only too happy to let the nationalists get their teeth kicked in while he built up a new power base in northwestern China. Sure, he dispatched his guerrillas to harass Japanese supply lines once in a while, but he spent most of the war circulating communist propaganda, painting stupid pictures, and composing yet more poetry. From time to time, both the Soviets and the Americans would fault Chiang Kai-shek for his reluctance to cooperate with Mao, but can any of you really blame him? Of course, Chiang was playing his own silly games, telling the Americans one thing and the Soviets another, so I don't know. There really aren't any heroes in this story, kids. I mean, I tried to find one, I really did. I looked long and hard, but my God, this subject is just so f***ing depressing. I hate this shit. I hate all of it. Why I ever let you convince me to do this is beyond me. What? What did you say? Oh, you've got some. Well, you're damn right I'd like a drink. Thank you, sir. Oh, that's good shit. That is good shit. Thank you. Thank you. I needed that. All right. One more paragraph. Ultimately, the war settled into a stalemate. China had lost her coastal cities and great swaths of her territory, but neither the National nor the Red Army had been decisively crushed. The Chinese did manage to tie down the bulk of Japanese ground forces, greatly aiding the Americans in their fiery Pacific Crusade. In 1945, the atomic bombs were dropped, the Soviets invaded Manchuria from the north, and the Japanese finally surrendered. China, for so long terrorized and brutalized by Japan, was now free at long last to terrorize and brutalize herself. Excuse me. Episode 13. North winds blow cruel arrows of winter, no duck to go in pot. This is Tiananmen. Not the square, that's over there. Between the monument to the people's heroes and the toilet. But up here is Tiananmen, which means Gate of Heavenly Peace. It was of yore the main entrance to the Forbidden City, and it was here in 1949 that Mao Zedong mounted the steps of the Great Palace and proclaimed the existence of a new country, the People's Republic of China. He couldn't use the simpler Republic of China since that was already taken, nor could he use the happy, well-fed People's Republic of China, since that has too many words, and is also an egregious misrepresentation. But I've gotten ahead of myself. As I'm sure you're aware, the Allies, for lack of a better word, won World War II. And if you don't know that, you should have your voting rights taken away. As the second of the main ground theaters of the war, China had suffered terribly. Nearly 20 million people, the majority of them civilians, had died either in combat or from the attendant disruption and famine or from any number of Japanese atrocities. The Kuomintang had been so thoroughly broken and battered by 8 years of war, they could scarcely reassert control over much of the country. Most of their best men, the most courageous, dedicated, and competent, were gone. They had perished and could not lend their strength to the struggle yet to come. The Red Army, by contrast, escaped the war in far better condition. It now also had a new source of strength. By 1945, Joseph Stalin had reversed the long-standing Soviet policy of supporting the Kuomintang. From thenceforth, the Soviets would solely support the CCP, sending weapons, vehicles, supplies, advisors, flags, lots and lots of flags, in ever-increasing quantities. But it was then, and would remain later, a loveless marriage. Mao Zedong never forgave the Soviet Union for their hesitancy to support him during the desperate decades of the 20s and 30s. He also resented Soviet meddling in Korea, where a man called Kim Il-sung, one of Mao's former guerrilla fighters, who spoke almost no Korean, was recently installed by the Soviets to head up their puppet regime. The Kim dynasty would go on to give the Chinese no shortage of headaches over the years and remains undoubtedly the most hilarious of all mass-murdering communist dictatorships.
Rocket Man, fire and fury. And then we fell in love. Okay?
And what about Chiang? He was backed by the United States and the steadfast China lobby, which would lead one to believe he had the most powerful advantage it was possible to have. Sort of. In my opinion, the United States doesn't get nearly enough criticism for how goddamn stupid their foreign policy was during the 1940s, and to be honest, during several other decades. In the afterglow of their great victory, the Americans rapidly demilitarized, blithely confident that the atomic bomb was sufficient to guarantee the new peace. President Truman, like President Roosevelt before him, initially did not know quite what to make of communism. After all, the communists preach equality, and that's a good thing, isn't it? They can't be nearly as bad as those awful fascists.
Members of a political movement originating in Italy.
Could they? Besides, the fascists
Members of a political movement originating in Italy.
hated the communists, so that means they're on our side, right? Wrong. Somehow, the delusional Americans were under the impression that the communists were just another political party, like Republicans or Democrats, and not a ruthless militant faction determined to seize power at all costs. This staggering ignorance about communism, especially and ironically among the best educated and well-read, persists to this very day. It is true that President Truman and the Americans made a fast U-turn on the Pinkos, but this was only after the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb, China fell into the hands of the communists, and the North Koreans poured across the 38th parallel. Only after it becomes blazingly obvious do Americans finally do the right thing, at which time we tend to go a little overboard and sometimes make things worse. It's almost as if we are a fundamentally decent and sensible people who are badly informed by our intellectuals and our press. Goodness, I hope that's not the case. Anyway, Chiang was understandably exasperated at being told to cooperate with people who hated him and were trying to kill him. On the other hand, the Americans were beginning to grow tired of Chiang's charade. Like many men who stay in power for too long, his foibles and eccentricities had begun to overwhelm his finer qualities and better judgment. The Kuomintang reflected his leadership, riddled as it was with corruption and nepotism. And as the fortunes of the Nationalist Army faltered, it fell into bitter infighting. Not unlike my appearance on the McLaughlin Group.
How much doom does Hillary face in the
November? Wait a minute. I was speaking. Eleanor, please. Eleanor, please, I have the floor. No, it was my turn. No, wait a minute. Loyal, sir, you're a rotten pustule of malignant stupidity. John?
Bye-bye.
In 1948, the Nationalist Army suffered a series of disastrous losses culminating in the seizure of Peking and Nanking by the Communists. As a result, Chiang was ousted as president and Lee Zongren, his main political rival, was put in charge. Lee Zongren was a former warlord and fairly capable military commander. His idea was to retreat to the south and defend what territory they could with their dwindling forces. By now, communist propaganda was so potent, entire units of the National Army were flipping over like hamburgers. Lee hoped to make a final stand that would, hopefully, entice the Americans to come to their rescue. However, Chiang, revealing himself once again to be a petty jackass, undercut Lee at every turn. For one thing, he shipped the government's last gold reserves to the island of Formosa, now Taiwan, for safekeeping just when Lee most needed to pay his increasingly unreliable troops. In the end, Lee Zongren's desperate last stand failed. The southern province of Canton, the birthplace of the Kuomintang, was captured. Chiang and the Kuomintang had lost the mandate of heaven, if you believe in that kind of balderdash, while Mao and his goons had picked it up for themselves. The point is, the triumphant communists now controlled the whole country. Li fled to the United States, where he vowed on his ancestors to kill Chiang Kai-shek.
In the ring. No, in real life!
But never got the chance. So Chiang flees to Taiwan with his medals and his sashes. Mao consolidates power, and to this day there are two Chinese governments. The Republic of China, or ROC, in Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China, or PRC, on the mainland, who would love nothing more to finally crush the ROC and reabsorb what they regard as a rebellious province. But you know, Taiwan turned out all right in the end. Despite Chiang's dictatorial style, his ruthless treatment of dissidents, his cult of personality, his insistence on a one-party state, and so on, Taiwan did not undergo nearly the same amount of trauma that the mainland would shortly suffer. Chiang might have been an authoritarian nationalist, but apparently that is better than being an authoritarian socialist, because one of those two things believes in outlandish fairy tales, and the other does not. So give the guy a break, is what I'm saying. He tried so hard to accomplish Sun's vision, but maybe that vision was flawed in the first place. That of a unified and centralized China, when perhaps a federated and liberal China would have been better. Still, there lingers the spirit of these men in all Chinese today, who recognize that something is off about their country, that some things, many things, might have been different.
Chiang Kai-shek, of all the world's statesmen, was to perceive the treachery of the communists. He was the first to fight them. A few years ago, he was exalted for the courage and tenacity of the fight he waged. Now, he is pilloried. Times have changed, but the man has not changed. Russia will never know one day of peace in China. Russia will never own China. China will remain free.
That's right. I forgot about all this shit. Episode 14. Great leap forward into deep dark pit filled with sharp sticks and poisonous toads. Here again are Chinese people, doing whatever it is they do. Group exercises, I guess. I don't know what the hell this is supposed to be. Remind me, how is this any less stupid than this? I mean, you tell me. If there ever was a people tailor-made for communism, I'd say it's probably the Chinese. Look, I'm not saying they're all mindless drones. That's nonsense. But they do have a very long history of putting up with authoritarian regimes and dealing with armies of bureaucrats. Nonetheless, communism is so goddamn retarded,
cognitively impaired,
that when Mao and his cronies forced it onto the unwitting Chinese people, they caused the worst man-made loss of life in all of history. And unlike the Soviets, they cannot plead ignorance here, because all this was just tried in the great neighbor to the north with devastating consequences. I mean, for Christ's sakes, you didn't even compare notes? You goddamn amateurs. How the f*** did you even get into power? It's like all luck. Do you remember that old Chaz fiasco from a few years ago? Yeah, imagine this guy running your country. That's what it was like under Mao Zedong. It bears repeating again and again that the greatest atrocities in history were committed by men who believed they were serving the ultimate good. It was not the sincerity of
This former German politician.
or Lenin or Stalin or Mao that was ever at fault. Nor was it any personal lust for prestige or wealth or women that motivated their great crimes against humanity. It was instead their blind devotion to erroneous ideologies. The communists, wherever they have seized power, did more harm when trying to help the people than they ever did from all their purges and mass executions. The famines in Russia and Ukraine are not so much a testament to diabolical Mephistophelian wickedness, but to doctrinaire pig-headedness and gross mismanagement. And I can think of no better example than the tragic waste of human potential that typifies the reign of Chairman Mao. It began with the landowners. Since the dawn of Chinese civilization, landlords had traditionally enjoyed special privileges similar to European nobility, which, even to a liberal, is fundamentally wrong. But instead of gradually weaning the country off this unjust system, Mao encouraged the peasants to simply murder the landowners and seize their land, because, of course, revenge is a part of this too. This sparked a cycle of pillage and mayhem much akin to the trials of the kulaks in Russia. Soon it was not merely the landlords who were in the dock, but rich peasants. And when I say rich, I'm saying they maybe had an extra pot to piss in. No one anywhere gave a damn about anything resembling consistency. After all, once you open the spigots to something like this, how do you turn them off? And for those of you who say, well, there's bound to be violence when an unjust system is overthrown, how do you explain the Japanese, who managed to achieve land reform decades earlier without killing between 1 to 3 million of their own people? Chiang Kai-shek, as bad as he was, also launched a land reform program on Taiwan that, miraculously, did not involve any killing. And none of the death tolls include the untold millions who were beaten, humiliated, robbed, and in many cases, forced to watch as their womenfolk were repeatedly. But that was just a foretaste. The Communist Party had yet to begin. Shut up. Of course, there were the customary purges. Over the next 10 years, just about anyone who had served or even known someone in the Kuomintang were rounded up and sent. Well, not to prisons. No. Prisons are relics of imperialist capitalism, don't you know? These are re-education centers, where you simply learn to be a better person. And until you do, you cannot leave. You must obey every directive, submit to hard labor and punitive punishment, and even if you comply in every degree, we still just might decide to shoot you on the spot. And here, Chairman Mao introduced a novel innovation in the ongoing communist experiment, something that has come to be called a struggle session. These involve taking a presumed malefactor, say a moderately successful baker or weaver or some other so-called imperialist, and submitting them to torrents of horrendous verbal and mental abuse, demanding they confess to non-existent crimes and deriding them for the general worthlessness of their own life.
Your work has caused harm.
That is you not recognizing your white privilege.
You're useless.
Sometimes the target's own friends and family were listed in this cruel practice, which the Chinese also refer to as jinhua, or as we say in English, washing of the brain.
Is this a struggle session? Are we in China?
I don't know if the point was to drive people to
self-deletion,
but in many instances that is precisely what happened. Across several Chinese cities, it was said you could not walk on the street without watching out for roof jumpers. Do these go onto the official death tolls? If so, you could add a couple more millions, snuffed out of existence by a vengeful mania fomented by fanatic psychopaths. Not that anyone complained, because there was nobody to complain to. Almost the first thing Mao did upon seizing power was assert control over the press. Chinese censorship is probably the most famous and durable kind of censorship in the world today, and let me tell you what I think about censorship. edicts with some kind of secret police? Pshaw! Who needs one of those things when you can have everyone else do your dirty work for you? What do I mean by everyone? Everyone! You see, in the twisted world of communist China, it was not some version of the Gestapo or the NKVD that terrorized the population. It was more often ordinary people. Husbands, wives, sons, daughters, neighbors, friends, co-workers, utterly brainwashed and baptized into the Maoist religion. Their belief in the righteousness of their cause was as unshakable as the early Christian saints and martyrs. They did not need to be told to shame, harass, plunder, or murder their supposedly innumerable class enemies. They sought them out continuously, which led in turn to mutual suspicion and bombastic public demonstrations of loyalty. Individualism of any kind gradually eroded away.
Deplatforming works.
That's a big game, man!
Not to be outdone by the Soviets, the Chinese organized their own, even larger collectivized farms, forcibly moved the peasants into dilapidated shacks, and ordered them to grow food using the latest and greatest idiotic commie methods. Explain something to me if you would. When someone tells you where to live, what to do all day, and doesn't pay you aside from a paltry amount of food, what does that make you? Well, class, anybody have an answer?
A slave? Is that what you mean?
Hey, I didn't say you could come back to class. Get out.
All right, Jesus, giant prick.
Watch your mouth, Billy. That's 2 strikes. The tragedy of the peasants, by far the majority of the Chinese population, was that out of their grief, their envy, and their frustration, they had made themselves the slaves of a greater and far more indifferent master. For this is the only way that socialism can practically function. You must turn the entire country into one big plantation. But Chairman Mao was not finished inventing ever newer and stupider ways to implement socialism. Like the Soviet Union, the CCP brainstormed wildly unrealistic 5-year plans to rapidly industrialize the nation. The most infamous of these was the second 5-year plan, christened by Mao as the Great Leap Forward. The first 5-year plan had relied mainly on Soviet assistance to construct massive Soviet-style factories, foundries, and so on, all built with essentially slave labor. However, for the Great Leap Forward, Mao got it into his head that the Chinese should do all these things completely from scratch. This inconceivable moron actually ordered the peasants, most of whom were barely educated, to start smelting steel in their homes. Each family was tasked to produce a certain tonnage of steel without being provided any raw materials, any equipment, or even the most basic instruction in metallurgy. Whether out of a sense of duty or fear, the Chinese peasants complied and started building crude stone kilns in their backyards. Now it turns out that modern steel production is in fact a highly complex, laborious process. The peasants never got anywhere near meeting their absurd quotas, and the steel they did produce was of such poor quality as to be utterly useless.
What are you, f***ing stupid?
The big-brain communists tampered around with agriculture too, where have I heard this one before, and came to the perfectly ignorant but quintessentially Marxist conclusion that household vermin are agents of capitalism. Yes, like capitalists, they exploit the labor of the proletariat and therefore must be totally eradicated. And by far, the worst of all these bourgeoisie oppressors was naturally that most vile and heinous creature, the sparrow. Oh sure, the sparrow looks harmless, some would say cute even, but beneath that clever facade of bourgeoisie innocence is a greedy manipulative capitalist just waiting to steal the production of the heroic worker.
The bird? Yeah, the bird!
Sparrows, you see, eat the seeds that fall from food crops.
Yummy.
And so they are no more than petty thieves of the people who must be killed to the last brood, which the Chinese attempted to do through something called the Smash Sparrow campaign. As part of the Smash Sparrow campaign, children were enlisted to bang pots and pans around, chasing the sparrows out of their nests. Later, adults knocked the nests out of the trees, crushed their eggs underneath their sandals, until there were almost no sparrows left in all of China. It didn't seem to occur to anyone that massively interfering with the ecosystem just might yield unintended consequences. Besides fallen grain, sparrows also eat insects, specifically plant-eating insects like, locusts. Within a year of the Smash Sparrow campaign, itself part of the larger For Pests campaign, the locust population exploded and they did what locusts do best. The communists had played God and literally created a biblical plague.
You dumb motherfuckers!
These are but two examples of the spiral of insanity caused by the Great Leap Forward. Unmentioned but present also were the rampant misuse of poisons and pesticides, widespread deforestation, and wildly inaccurate record-keeping. Why inaccurate record-keeping? Well, anyone who could write was assumed to be a capitalist or capitalist adjacent and sent to a collective farm, while anyone who was a vicious rural thug was assumed to have attained revolutionary consciousness and so put in charge of food distribution. The problem was exacerbated further by the Chinese predilection towards saving face. No one wanted to admit they were being anything other than a good productive communist, so they simply lied to their superiors, who lied to their superiors, and so on, all the way up the chain of command. This led the authorities to believe in the existence of a food surplus when in reality the country was teetering on the brink of disaster. The diversion of peasants from food to steel production further reduced the harvest yield, and all it took was one bad drought in one province to trigger a chain reaction that brought China to her knees. From 1959 to 1962, the Great Chinese Famine took more lives than the Chinese Civil War and World War II combined. The true figure will never be known, but reliable estimates put the death toll between 20 to 50 million people. In some provinces, nearly 20% of the population perished in less than 3 years. Famines are remembered differently from wars or genocides. Wars, for whatever reason, enthrall the imagination. They stand out in history like the great peaks of a mountain range, salient events of which stories can be told, in which heroes or villains can be recognized, from which lessons are drawn and imparted to future generations. None of this is really true of famines, even those perpetrated by human folly. There seems a great eagerness to forget and not to remember them. Perhaps it is because there is no drama in famine as there is in war. There are no great armies or battles, no daring assaults or desperate last stands. There are simply millions of people hobbling to and fro, watching themselves and their loved ones gradually diminish, until they finally lie down in exhaustion and mundanely expire. Yet every life taken is no less tragic or avoidable than those lost in the great wars of history. The suffering of the survivors no less traumatic or heartrending. For 3 years, the people of China were reduced to eating worms and grasshoppers, boiling the bark of trees with strands of grass, and yes, even butchering their own dead for meat. You know, I'm getting a little tired of this shit. It's the same damn story every time. The Maos and Lenins of this world, their minds pickled in a brine of Marxist drivel, plow ahead with their reckless, boneheaded proposals, unhindered by any feedback from reality. In Marxism, truth takes a backseat to theory. The theory, in fact, becomes the truth, and the truth, if contrary to theory, becomes lies. It's even worse than that, actually, for in Marxism there is another concept known as praxis. Praxis is another one of those made-up bullshit terms that means combining theory and practice together. Whenever you hear people talk about doing the work, this is what they're getting at. Basically, praxis amounts to putting half-baked ideas into practice and then retroactively reworking those ideas whenever they fail in any number of disastrous ways.
Of comprehensive police reform to be... Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
It's so gratifying to leave you wallowing in the mess you've made. You're screwed. Thank you. Bye.
Oh, so sorry millions of people had to die of starvation. But we hadn't quite worked out our communist theory of pest control yet. This famine was, in fact, a necessary and welcome development of our praxis. My God, it's like these people have a license to be stupid. Whenever the rest of us f*** up, we have to admit our mistakes and make amends, but not these assholes. They get to claim that any failure of their ideas, any oversight or contradiction in their thinking, is merely an inseparable component of praxis. They don't even have the goddamn basic humility to admit that once in a while they can be wrong. Marxists, of course, are never wrong because Marxism itself cannot possibly be wrong, and if Marxists are never wrong, how can they learn from their mistakes or their errors? The answer is they can't and they don't. Typically, it requires the death of the current dictator for a communist society to even have half a chance at any kind of reform. And unlike Lenin, who at least had the decency to die of a massive stroke, Mao Zedong would live and live some more, and persist in not dying in any number of painful ways, and still live and live and live. Ni hao, Jie Shi, James O'Flannery, Zhi Jin Shin De Chanmen Bufen, Wu Zhenhui, the Communist Party of China, Wu Chon Chin Chong Ni De Aizhata, Chi Shi Yin Yang De, Chairman Mao, Wu Ye Chuan Chin Chuan E Aizha She, Wu Wei Wu De Wu Zhi Shen Bian Chang Ye, Wu Wei Wu De Hua Shen Gan Kon Kui. Episode 15. Big fat idiot with stupid fat face do stupid dumb things. The Great Leap Forward was such a titanic fiasco that even Mao was forced to eat crow. At least that fat had something to eat. Yeah, nobody was missing any meals at the Mao residence. Anyway, he ended up resigning from several of his official positions. A new generation of communist leaders, including reformer Deng Xiaoping, began to rise in power and attempted to clean up the mess Mao had made. Meanwhile, other figures, such as General Peng Duo, probably China's best military mind, dared to speak out about the disaster and were consequently purged. Keep in mind that General Peng had been involved in Chinese affairs since the long-ago Northern Expedition. He had been one of the survivors of the Long March, led guerrilla forces against Japan, later battled the Kuomintang, and had been overall commander of Chinese forces during the Korean War. Oh, God damn it, I forgot to mention the Korean War. Everybody forgets about the Korean War. Yes, I think I better brief you. Alright. Kim Il-sung, even bigger, even fatter idiot than Mao Zedong, invades the South. South nearly defeated. MacArthur, genius but crazy, lands Incheon. Drives to Chinese border, Yalu River. Chinese invade, ambush Americans. Americans and South Koreans pushed back. Truman, furious. MacArthur, fired. Matthew Ridgway, promoted. Probably greatest unsung commander American history. Saves the day. Stalemate forever. Kimchi tastes like raw sewage. There you go, Korean War. So Peng Duai, who had served the communist cause ably and loyally through thick and thin, was thrown into the trash heap like a used Kleenex. Do you ever notice how often this happens? Why do the worst sort of ruthless, faithless, vengeful characters always rise to the top of socialist hierarchies? For that, I must once again turn to my good friend and colleague, Professor Friedrich Hayek.
That we can design social institutions in their working. Now, that is basically mistaken. social institutions have never been designed.
Okay, look, what he's trying to say, but can't because he's very old and Austrian, is that collectivism, exempli gratus, socialism, theocracy, etc., requires a great deal of social and economic coercion in order to function. Far more than, say, liberalism. I mean, we do have to obey traffic laws sometimes, and we just can't run around stealing shit. But other than that, a freer society will generally have fewer laws that require enforcement. Not so within a collectivist society which is explicitly designed to mobilize people towards some larger, theoretically communal goal. Anyway, it is indubitable that collectivism necessitates far more state compulsion, which renders it inevitable that far more violent force will be directed against the population. And this violence can make some collectivists a little squeamish. Happily for them, there does exist a certain kind of person who, believe it or not, actually enjoys beating the snot out of others, or humiliating them, or torturing them, or leaving them to starve in their own filth. And this sort of depraved monster, shunned to the fringes in liberal societies, suddenly becomes a very valuable person in a collectivist one. Oh, those polite and urbane academics may convince a great number of people to join in their revolution, but don't you worry, they won't be in power for very long. The needs of their preferred system, by its very nature authoritarian and most often totalitarian, will, sooner or later, bring to the surface the kinds of men who can do what the soft consciences of those academic types won't permit them to do. Hard, brutal, savage men, who, if they ever had a conscience, lost it many years ago. Throughout the 1960s, Mao was increasingly sidelined by Deng Xiaoping and others who were somewhat less doctrinaire and therefore slightly more reasonable about things like ensuring the survival of the Chinese people. All the while, Mao stewed in rage. To soothe himself, Mao allegedly sought the company of young virgins, some allegedly as young as 14. Who were forced to dance with him, dine with him, and then endure the sight of his allegedly green teeth, and also allegedly, but also very probably, unwashed genitalia. Mao often enjoyed comparisons between himself and the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who sought to extend his life by bathing himself in the fluids produced by, well, you know, when a lady is in the mood, shall we say.
Vagina.
Which, according to traditional Chinese medicine, has wondrous rejuvenating properties.
Ooh, I like the sound of that.
Remind me never to consult Chinese medicine. Oh, and I still got my Chinese doctor joke. We'll continue and then see if we have time. By now, Mao Zedong was in his 70s. He had outlived Lenin, Stalin. This guy killed millions and millions of people, crippled the Chinese economy for years to come, and now was getting his nasty on with helpless, innocent girls. And he got away with it, all of it. He never suffered any comeuppance, not even gout or something. At least a toothache. Where were you on that one, God? Sometimes, you know, I think you get a little distracted up there. No, I don't really mean that. Yes. I'll take Gladys to the doctor tomorrow. I said I would, wouldn't I? Jesus. Despite his exalted position and immense personal wealth, Mao Zedong just couldn't go quietly into the night. Annoyed and irritated by the younger rising stars of the party, Mao concluded the only way to retain control of his revolutionary government was another revolution. Now, you may ask yourself, how can the most powerful figure of both party and state orchestrate a revolution against party and state? Well, somehow Mao found a way. He went down to the basement, dusted off the old propaganda machine, and began pumping out reams and reams of outlandish gobbledygook. He hurled slanderous and malicious accusations like they were frisbees, denouncing his erstwhile friends and colleagues with no evidence and without a second thought. Mao declared that counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie elements had infiltrated the glorious People's Republic of China, and that only the pure and unspoiled youth could be relied upon to right the ship. To impress the youngsters, Mao even ripped off his shirt in public and went for a swim in the Yangtze River, almost certainly the first bath he had had since 1925. The local population of river carp has never recovered. These are historical facts. Still, Mao was onto something here. He correctly perceived there was an untapped, nearly limitless supply of frothing, senseless goons he could bend and twist to his purposes. They were called children, and he used the apparatus of the so-called education system to indoctrinate these, in their own way innocent victims, into his great proletarian cultural revolution. My God, not even Karl Marx thought that up. As we all know, young people are not only the most careful and responsible members of society, they are also the most enlightened, judicious, and sagacious. As with the peasants 40 years earlier, Mao provoked these youngsters into fits of hysteria, empowering them to believe they were right about everything so long as everything they were right about was in his little red book. Pretty incredible and totally believable that every oddity or mystery of life can be answered by a little red book. Of course, I'm being facetious. All the damn thing was a compendium of Mao's numerous idiotic quotations. In case you're curious, here's the first one I happened to look up.
We should support whatever enemy opposes, and oppose whatever enemy support.
Well, that's not confusing. What if the enemy starts supporting what you currently support? Do you have to start opposing what you previously supported? Explain. Never mind, I don't even want to hear it. How about this one?
The socialist system will eventually replace capitalist system. Is objective raw independent of man's will.
Well, if that's true, why bother having a revolution at all? Why not just wait around? Write a couple of pamphlets or whatever and, just enjoy life. Oh, but I keep forgetting. Revolutions are just too much dang fun. You youngsters want some real wisdom? Here's a quotation for you. I call it O'Flannery's first law. Those who read little believe every little thing they read. Try that one on for size, why don't you? To direct the formless fury of the youngsters, Mao drew their attention to what he called the 4 O's, these being old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. He conveniently left out old chairmen of political parties, but that goes without saying. He christened his teenaged revolutionaries the Red Guards, and in 1966 unleashed them like a typhoon against the unsuspecting Chinese population. Almost overnight, China was transformed into a modern-day college campus. Among other things, these maniacs tore down street signs and replaced them with new ones, all named after Mao Zedong, rendering basic city navigation utterly impossible. Any of this sound familiar to you? I swear I've seen something like this recently. Things got so much worse. The Red Guards indiscriminately tore down statues and monuments, some hundreds or even thousands of years old. They broke into local shrines and monasteries and burned everything they could get their filthy, grubby hands on. The monks, despite all their years of intense martial arts training, also happened to be moronic pacifists who could only watch in barely restrained revulsion. The mayhem knew no limits. Ancient cemeteries were desecrated. Old tombs were vandalized. Some even dug up the bones of former emperors and pissed on them. More egregious still was the senseless destruction of millions of pages of Chinese writing. Everything from Confucian texts to classical Tang poetry. All were thoughtlessly burned and are now forever lost. Who knows, there might have been a cure for cancer somewhere in there. Probably not, but still. It's a funny kind of education that encourages students to burn and not to read. The Red Guards were also fond of subjecting their elders to humiliating displays of public contrition. Whole families were ripped apart by this generational strife. Fathers pitted against sons, mothers pitted against daughters, dunce caps shoved onto the heads of teachers, dogs forced to watch cats fornicating. I mean, can you just imagine being harangued by someone like this little twerp?
Hello, everyone.
Shut up, you. This is my grandson, by the way. I forget his name, but he's what you might call a cretin. Even Madame Mao got in on the action.
Nasty woman.
Forming the notorious Gang of Four with, 3 other people. Their specialty was to recruit elite paramilitary outfits from the cream of the Red Guard, then dispatch these roving goon squads to berate, intimidate, and occasionally torture other communist officials. Their crimes could be anything. They might be badly incompetent, or altogether too competent, or guilty of demonstrating insufficient adherence to Mao Zedong thought. However, the madness only truly reached its apex with the onset of the Guangji Massacre, an event so deranged and bestial it strains the bounds of civilized credulity. Across several villages in Guangji province, student revolutionaries, in the grasp of a collective delirium that defies all understanding of human behavior, attacked, tortured, raped, and killed their own parents, teachers, classmates, and any party officials deemed unworthy of the name. They tied sticks of dynamite to their fellow classmates and lit the fuse. They performed ritual disemboweling on live victims, cheering and laughing at what they must have thought was fine sport. Most abominably of all, they cut out the hearts and livers of those they murdered and ceremonially consumed them. Such ritualistic cannibalism is unheard of in all except the most remote and primitive societies. China, who had given the world silk and paper, who had accomplished such marvelous feats of engineering, who had constructed such beautiful temples and pavilions, who had begun to peer into the secrets of the cosmos and the vagaries of the human soul, that fascinating and venerable nation had been reduced to this. Now, the usual twits and charlatans will argue that nothing in Marxism condones such behavior, that incidents like these, and there were others, are merely aberrations. But when your worldview collapses all human interaction into an endless war between mortal class enemies, how can you possibly be surprised? Or rather, how can you be surprised and retain your reputation as an intelligent person? All in all, another 1 million people paid with their lives for China's pointless descent into wanton chaos. True, many of those purged were idiotic communist apparatchiks themselves, but some, like Deng Xiaoping, were the closest things China had to effective officials and statesmen. It's a miracle any of them survived. Deng Xiaoping himself was sent to perform hard labor at a tractor factory, while his son was thrown out of a 4-story window and lived the rest of his life as a paraplegic. But Deng would have the last laugh. In 1976, Premier Zhou Enlai, Mao's longtime right-hand man, died of cancer. Not long after, Mao Zedong himself succumbed to a heart attack, inspiring an outpouring of grief from the deluded Chinamen.
Men from China.
He had for so long dominated and enslaved. To this day, you will hear voices in China and elsewhere praise Mao Zedong as the man who single-handedly united and liberated China. And for this, despite his faults and missteps, he should be commemorated as one of the greatest leaders in Chinese history. I favor a different analysis. In 1947, as the Chinese Civil War was still raging, India gained her independence from Great Britain. Like China, India is an ancient land with its own complex history and unique blend of cultures.
Swami Vive Kamunand.
Unlike China, which was only partly colonized, India was fully colonized and integrated into the British Empire, which would lead your modern academic to conclude that India would have had the harder road ahead. And yet, by the 1960s, despite the partition of India, several local uprisings, and a few stupid 5-year plans of their own, India eventually emerged as an independent functioning democracy with a range of political parties alongside a mostly free and unencumbered press. Meanwhile, in China, some 40 to 70 million people died as a result of Mao's policies. He squelched whatever chance the Chinese had at living in a free and open society. He killed or encouraged others to kill many of the brightest and most talented Chinese. He never paid for his crimes and died peacefully of old age. I have nothing else to say.
It does no good to mourn the past. We pass along a road of time which, always turning, never brings us back to the crossroads marked again. Perhaps we should never have disturbed the slumbering civilization of China. Perhaps China is too vast to be governed by mercy. Yet if Chinese mind craves order, they must be brought to recognize they are the biggest factor in the world's disorder. And we must untangle the madness of their mind. The most difficult task in the world is to reach the minds of men who hate you.
Episode whatever number we're on. Do I really have to talk about this anymore? I just want to go home. In 1972, at the height of the Cultural Revolution's insanity, an unlikely visitor stepped onto the tarmac of the Peking something or other airport. He was tall, handsome, graceful, his serene visage concealing the memories of great personal pain and adversity. Adversity over which he had long ago triumphed with magnanimous equipoise and inimitable aplomb. He was then the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States of America, and his name was Richard Nixon. Oh, look, Gladys, it's him, he's here. Come on, let's do the chant I told you about. Come on. We like Dick, we like Dick, we like Dick. Come on, Gladys, let's go, get with the program. We like Dick, we like... Gladys, I'm beginning to think you really don't like Dick. Now, what was Nixon doing in China? Well, this is kind of interesting. For 2 decades, the American foreign policy establishment had assumed that the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were in lockstep over the mutual goal of promoting communism around the globe. However, this turned out to be untrue. Mao never loved Stalin, and his relationship with Khrushchev was even frostier. Despite his military support for Kim Il-sung during the Korean War, he privately hated that corpulent fragment of human detritus, whom he correctly regarded as a Soviet stooge. In any case, by 1956, relations between the Soviet Union and China broke down, an event later known as the Sino-Soviet split. Amazingly, in a time of manic international espionage, the split went unnoticed in the West except by a handful of highly astute observers, men such as, Richard Nixon. The opportunity to peel China away from the Soviet Union intrigued him for years, and by 1972, with the Vietnam War winding down and his popularity at home secure, Nixon felt the time was right to roll the dice. His week-long visit to China and the surrounding negotiations between the two countries has had, to put it mildly, world-changing consequences. First, the United States adopted a strategically ambiguous view of Taiwan, which it had previously recognized as the sole legitimate Chinese government. For better or worse, this view remains official American policy to this very day. Second, the normalization of relations led to significant foreign investment and development in China, which is all the Western powers from Great Britain on down ever really wanted. Nixon also managed to swindle a couple of panda bears from the Chi-Coms. There was that first one, Sing Sing, who I seem to remember as kind of cute, and that other one, Ling Ling, who was just a giant whore. These are historical facts. By the 1970s, a century or more of progressive policies had undermined that traditional pillar of Western economies, manufacturing. To stay competitive, especially against rising economies such as a rebuilding Japan, also eager to invest in China, Western businesses relocated a significant portion of their production to China. The reasons for doing so were many and obvious. Labor came cheap in a country approaching 1 billion people, and for whom unionization was flat out illegal. For their part, millions of Chinese were willing to work in massive factories for less than $1 a day, which was more money than most had ever earned in their lives. Safety codes, environmental regulation, none of that existed in China, or for that matter in India, Indonesia, or Bangladesh. Not that I really care about the environment all that much. Matter of fact, you know what I think we should do to the environment?
How dare you!
Shut up!
Thus began the time-honored progressive hypocrisy of not in my backyard. Rampant unregulated pollution? All that's fine, so long as it's not in my backyard. Massive carbon dioxide emissions from monstrously huge coal-fired power plants? Sure, whatever, just not in my backyard. Extremely low wages and harsh working conditions for poor, politically powerless, and almost exclusively non-white workers. Did you hear what I said? Not in my backyard. Anywhere else is fine. If I don't know about it, then I can't get on my high horse about it, can I? For their part, political conservatives were only too happy to please their traditional business base, a relationship that's been rather strained of late, without giving much, if any, thought to the future. Profits were soaring, and all the rest of us were content, I suppose, to buy cheap crap we really didn't need, and which has probably made our lives worse. Flat-screen televisions, cellular phones, custom-printed t-shirts, balderdash. The latest thing is this vaping nonsense. And I know that's what most of you are doing when my back is turned. I wasn't born yesterday, you know. Don't insult my intelligence.
It makes me very angry.
You goddamn puss. Why can't you smoke cigarettes like a real man? I mean, what the hell? Do you think you're going to live forever or something? My father died at 62, and let me tell you, he had the right idea. I wish I went back in 99 or 2000 or whatever it was. Then I could have skipped out on all this dumb. The other character responsible for China's massive economic shift was the aforementioned Deng Xiaoping. In 1977, fully rehabilitated after Mao's demise, Deng outmaneuvered his CCP rivals and won the top job. Under his premiership, the Chinese economy exploded. All the stupid and costly experiments of the Mao era, the farmers and workers' collectives, the anti-this and anti-that campaigns were formally abolished. Special economic zones were created in major cities where private citizens, almost exclusively CCP members, could establish their own businesses with somewhat lessened interference from the state. The Chinese called this system socialism with Chinese characteristics. But you could easily call it Chinamism with socialist characteristics, and it'd be the same goddamn thing. Whereas the United States consists of a free market economy with a regulatory regime bolted onto it, China consists of a government-supervised economy with free markets injected into it. That's not a perfect illustration, but it's the best I can do. This stuff is complicated. Part of China's astronomical growth was also due to the fact that they were starting from nowhere. There were roads, dams, power plants, sewage plants, airports, skyscrapers, and all manner of infrastructure to build. Now that the communist hardliners were sidelined, China could finally roll up her sleeves and get to work. Say what you will about the Chinese, none can deny that they are, and always have been, a marvelously skilled and industrious people. It took Great Britain 7 generations to transform themselves from an agrarian society into an industrialized society. The Chinese, after a false start, managed it in 1 generation. Of course, they plagiarized the f*** off their classmates, so I have no choice but to give them a D-. Yet in the end, Deng Xiaoping's reforms probably saved the regime. They are the reason why the People's Republic of China still stands, while the Soviet Union crumbled into the dustbin of history. Opening China to foreign investment combined with relaxed state control and interference triggered an economic boom that lasted for nearly 40 years and only recently seems to have petered out. But alas, the hopes of many within and without China that liberal economic reforms would lead to liberal political reforms have proven to be a phantasmagoric mirage. Episode 17. We China, our turn, f*** up world now. And so we arrive back at the beginning, which also happens to be the ending. This is China in the 21st century. It is a land of contrasts, a land governed by a workers' political party whose membership is tightly controlled by the rich and powerful, a land ruled by a paranoid authoritarian state that fiercely censors its citizens, but which is far more relaxed or reckless when it comes to industry and scientific research. A land whose great productive might compels other nations to cooperate with it, but which has no real friends on the world stage. That is China today. The Marxist true believers are all just about gone now, and China has slowly reverted back to what it always was, an autocratic regime based in the north, ruling a gigantic country via an elaborate technocratic bureaucracy. The Mao dynasty, as I suppose we must call it, is in full bloom. The current emperor of China is called Xi Jinping.
我在北京。
He is the quintessential example of this new communist aristocracy, having been literally born in the Forbidden City and known in his youth as one of the Red Princes. However, Xi's life was not all sunshine and roses. As a teenager, the Cultural Revolution came for Xi's family, and a young Xi had to watch his mother publicly denounce his father, while his sister was driven to
self-deletion
by the Red Guards. Xi himself was sent to work in a poor village in the countryside, a grueling experience that left a lasting impression. But Xi persevered, and once the Cultural Revolution ran its course, he and his father were rehabilitated and reconciled. His meteoric rise to power is a fascinating story that I cannot share in full here. But do not doubt that as of this moment, Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese ruler since Mao Zedong. Like his predecessors, Xi has imbibed the traditional view that China's rightful place in the world is as the Middle Kingdom, a little lower than heaven, but very much on top of everybody else. He represents a new generation of Chinese, a generation who did not experience the humbling poverty and turmoil of the Mao years, a generation who has only known surging prosperity in their own country and calamitous discord in their principal Western counterpart. And so they seek to assert themselves on the world stage. The Dragon Reborn will brook no rival. She will certainly not tolerate a Pacific sphere led by the United States, and she casts her eyes jealously onto that wayward province surrounded by the sea. But first things first, in 2020, the city-state of Hong Kong, which had flourished as a British colony and later a semi-autonomous region, was reabsorbed by the Chinese mainland under nefarious circumstances. Everything that once made Hong Kong unique or special is currently being crushed under the steely treads of Chinese hegemony. Elsewhere around the world, Emperor Xi and his mandarins have embarked on a neo-colonization scheme that would make the Europeans blush. Their favorite technique is called a debt trap, in which the Chinese provide generous loans to poorer countries for infrastructure improvements, monies which are naturally turned around and paid to Chinese contractors. When the country fails to repay the debt, and they almost always do, the Chinese simply assert ownership over the dam, railroad, port, or what have you, and lease it back to the country in which it exists. This ruthless and heavy-handed diplomacy has not endeared China very much to those countries with which it is ideologically aligned. Strangely, China has had better luck infiltrating the corporations and institutions of Western countries, which nominally ought to be ideologically opposed to China in every conceivable way.
But there will be things we will disagree on, and we will have
It turns out that modern-day corporate executive types are every bit as asinine, avaricious, and pusillanimous as petty tin-pot dictators. The company known as Google, who is only too happy to lecture Western nations on all their sins, jumps at any chance to assist China in censoring its own citizenry. I would very much like to ask the brains behind Google why a company whose main business is the retrieval of information is helping prevent nearly 1/5 of the world's people from retrieving information. The rot goes deeper still. At prestigious Western universities, entire purpose-built dormitories exist for a new generation of red princes and princesses, the children of Chinese oligarchs, who arrive on campus driving Ferraris and Lamborghinis, perform next to no academic work, and receive a diploma anyway because their parents pay full ride.
就是上水的时候去 Pasadena，
我朋友接我去了。
为什么要切成这个颜色？
因为它漂亮啊。I like that people love my car.
Not even sports and entertainment are free of China's malign and insidious influence. Once beloved American film studios, such as Disney, proclaim their allegiance to the stunning and brave LGBT movement, and later quietly edit out any gay shit for their Chinese audiences. And I believe I speak for the great majority of Americans when I say to such institutions, tread carefully. Remember which side you're on. It isn't out of the realm of possibility that China and the West will come to blows in the near future, and if and when that happens, we will not forget where you stand now. Alright, really quickly, a few odds and ends and tidbits. The Tiananmen Square Massacre. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms did little to stem the rampant corruption and political dysfunction of China's one-party state. In 1989, students flooded Peking with a range of demands and, okay, look, it's just the guy with the tech. That's all anybody remembers. That one brave son of a bitch. And the tech. That man deserves a statue somewhere. Oh, I guess they have a few already. Well, good. Anyway, as to the man's identity or fate, nobody seems to know. Alas, we do know that several thousand protesters were killed and many more imprisoned as part of the CCP's brutal crackdown. Any of the then ongoing political reforms were halted and most later abandoned. The one-child policy. Surprise, surprise, wouldn't you know it? The overpopulation cultists of the 60s and 70s found an eager audience in China for all their misanthropic balderdash.
We're in the middle of a climate crisis, and yet we somehow need to feed a growing population at the same time.
So it turns out the whole policy was unnecessary in the first place. As China opened up and people moved into the burgeoning cities, they naturally had or desired to have fewer children. Meanwhile, rural families found their reproduction artificially constrained, and by this point China is basically screwed. What China once offered to the world, and for the time being still offers to the world, is relatively cheap and reliable labor. That is all going to go away within, depending on who you ask, a decade or two. Their overbuilt cities will be half empty, and so much public and private investment will be rendered worthless from lack of demand. The Uyghur Genocide. For a description of these ongoing events, I am now pleased to turn over the lecture to a Muslim man.
If we're going to talk about sex, I'd love to hit some of the fine points of technique.
Hello? Is anyone there? It's me, James O'Flannery. I've signed into the Zoom phone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You don't have to shout.
And now, dear listeners, it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of the very best and only brown students I've had the opportunity to teach. Mr. Siraj
Hashmi. Siraj Hashmi. Come on, we've been over this a million times.
All right, don't get cocky, kid. Just because you're all successful now, it's like all those times you refused to take off your hat in class.
You mean my tequila?
Gesundheit.
No, that's what it's called.
I know what I said. Now we're gonna get going here. I don't have all day.
Okay, fine. Let's talk about this. So the Uyghurs are one of China's largest ethnic minorities, between 11 and 12 million strong, who have lived in northwestern China for hundreds of years. They're also, as most of you probably know, Muslim.
Yes, naturally. Also of Turkic extraction.
Hey. Are you gonna let me do this? So anyway, the Uyghurs have had a rocky relationship with the Chinese over the years. Essentially, they don't want to be Chinese, and the Chinese insist they must become Chinese, or else. This has led to a massive program of forced assimilation since at least 2014, roughly when Xi Jinping took power. Uyghurs are being forced to give up their culture and religion through re-education, and when that doesn't work, the Chinese have attempted to literally breed them out of existence. Uyghur men who refuse to become, quote, Chinese are forcibly sterilized. Pregnant Uyghur women are forced to have abortions. Many women are also raped by Han Chinese prison guards and forced to give birth to a, quote, Chinese baby. In addition, there are reports of live organ harvesting taking place in camps that are definitely not concentration camps, because those only exist in history or something.
Hey, Siraj, very true, but about those organs. Say I know a certain Irishman who needs another liver. You wouldn't happen to have a number or something for Siraj? Is this connection still on? Can you hear me?
Anyway, isn't it odd that our media overlords highlight some genocides and ignore others? I mean, in that Disney Mulan remake, during the credits, they actually thanked the Xinjiang Province Security Service, which is the same organization keeping over 1 million Uyghurs illegally detained. That's like Disney filming Snow White in 1930s Germany and then thanking the SS for helping them with security, or finding them cheap labor or something. How the fuck is Disney not taking it on the chin for this shit? Seriously, where's Al-Qaeda when you need them? You boys might want to get in on this. I mean, who am I to tell you what to do with your time? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey? Are any of you have an opinion on this? Oh, wait a minute, that's right. China's throwing you mountains of cash. What a bunch of fucking hypocrites.
Whoa, hang on there, young man. What have I told you about issuing fatwas? Remember what happened last time?
That wasn't a fatwa. My parents sued the school when you brought in donuts for every day of Ramadan and then ate them in front of me.
Balderdash, it doesn't sound like me at all.
Yes, it does. You looked me in the face and said, this is for 9/11.
Sorry, Siraj. You're breaking up on my end. I can't hear you. It was nice talking to you, but Episode 18. Village Elder instructs local youth on path to true wisdom. Well, that's it. I made it to the end, praise God. Now Now, I don't want to talk about this country ever again with you or with anyone. I'm canceling the question and answer session. No, I'm sorry. Everyone will just have to hang up. There's really just one last question left anyway. The Chinese Revolution. Good thing, bad thing. Answer, pointless thing. I mean, what do you want me to say? Is revolution even the right word to use here? Just because some new faction seizes power in a chaotic fashion, does that technically make it a revolution? Say what you will about the French Revolution, at least half their ideas stuck around. The French monarchy and nobility are no more. They are governed by a freely elected parliament, and French citizens enjoy broad protections of their individual rights. In the case of the Chinese, it isn't clear much has happened other than the transition of the Qing dynasty to the Mao dynasty. The same goes for Russia, and if you recall, I made that point in my last lecture. Communism never leads anywhere because communism is a goddamn pipe dream, a dead end, a social impossibility even at the smallest of scales. Ergo, it might be better to think of both the Russian and Chinese revolutions as prolonged and bloody modernization efforts. That much at least has come to pass. But did you really need to kill 100 million people to pull that off? Oh, what am I going to do with you, China? How can you both delight and disturb me so? What majestic wonders you have brought into our world, and yet what unspeakable terrors also. You are ever a land of contrasts. Northern China, what you might call Yellow River China, has historically been the dominant partner. That China represents the militant, homogenizing, autocratic tendencies of Chinese civilization. But southern China, what you might call Yangtze River China, represents the more freewheeling, commercial, and entrepreneurial tendencies. If Confucius, with his doctrines of filial piety and social perfection, is the patron saint of the Chinese state, then Lao Tzu, with his almost libertarian leanings, may be the patron saint of the Chinese people. It is said that towards the end of his life, Lao Tzu rode a water buffalo into the West and was never seen or heard from again. But is it possible that through some curious transmutation of time and space, he has reappeared centuries later to add his voice to the chorus of liberty? And if he has reappeared, just what would he say?
Hey everybody, I'm Chinese! What? This is how I feel inside.
Now, I'm hardly the first person to observe the West caught in the convulsions of its own cultural revolution these days. Struggle sessions disguised as anti-harassment training. Speech codes disguised as basic etiquette. The erasure or modification of old stories and works of art to reflect contemporary attitudes. If groups like Antifa are pygmy imitations of the rowdy Bolshevik or Jacobin mobs, then these far more sophisticated activists and journalists are something like an imitation of the sinister Red Guards. Their aim is not so much the violent overthrow of existing institutions, but their slow corruption into tools of their transformative vision. A vision they cannot articulate with specificity, either because they themselves barely understand it, or because they know it would be rejected out of hand. Yet they've made a good deal of headway, you've got to hand it to them. They've managed to hoodwink millions of otherwise decent, well-meaning people into supporting their vague and nebulous agenda. What a grim and unhappy commentary on the frailty of human judgment in the face of pleasing slogans and reputational blackmail.
Why are you gay?
Who says I'm gay?
You are gay. You are a transgender.
Yet one thing stands in their way. And it is the very same thing that prevented the Red Guards from irrevocably transforming the Chinese people into mindless servants of Maoism. It is tradition, that unbroken series of customs, habits, beliefs, and attitudes that binds a people to their ancestors, to those they shall never meet or speak to, but with whom they commune through those mystic chords of ritual and memory. Tradition is like a chain that both constrains us and guides us. Of course, we may, especially in our younger years, strain and struggle against this chain of tradition. We may perceive faults or flaws and believe ourselves or our generation to be uniquely perspicacious enough to radically improve upon what our ancestors have made, perhaps even to break the chain entirely and start afresh. Yet every link in our chain of tradition was once a radical idea too. Everything that conservatives vigorously defend was once argued passionately by reformers of past ages. What is tradition anyway, if not a compilation of the best and most proven radical ideas of the past? The unexpectedly beneficial precipitate or residue, retrieved after thousands upon thousands of mostly useless and wasteful progressive experimentation. To be a conservative, therefore, to stick to tradition, is to be almost always right about everything almost all the time, but not quite all the time, and that is the tricky part. How can we improve society? How can we devise better governments, better customs, better habits, better beliefs, without breaking the good we have inherited? How can we identify and replace the weaker links in our chain of tradition without totally severing our connection to the past? I believe we must begin from a place of gratitude. We must hold in our minds a recognition that life can be and has been far worse. We must realize there are hard limits to the world as revealed by science, and unchangeable aspects of human nature as revealed by history, religion, philosophy, and literature. And these two facts in combination create permanent unsolvable problems for mankind, which we can only evade or mitigate through those traditions we once found so constraining. To paraphrase my great friend G.K. Chesterton, before you tear down a fence, understand why it was put up in the first place. I cannot fault a single person for wishing to make a better world for themselves and their children, but I can admonish some persons for being so ungrateful and ignorant, they mistake tradition itself as the cause of every evil under the sun. Small wonder then that their harebrained alternatives routinely overlook those aspects of society without which it cannot function or perpetuate itself into the future. Besides, there are other things tied up in tradition other than moral guidance or the management of collective affairs. Tradition also involves how we delve into the mysteries of the universe, how we elevate the basic needs of food, shelter, and clothing into art forms unto themselves, how we represent truth and beauty and locate ourselves within the vast swirling cosmos beyond our all too brief and narrow experience. It is miraculous that we have come as far as we have, and at any given time we can throw that all away by thoughtlessly pursuing faddish trends. A healthy respect for tradition opens the door to true wisdom. A lack of respect leads only to novelty worship and malign sophistry. Now, not every tradition is equal, and not everything in a given tradition is worth preserving, but like the Chinese, who show such great deference to the wisdom of their ancestors, I wish more in the West would admire or even learn about their own. Like the Chinese, we are the legatees of a glorious tradition. A tradition that encompasses the poetry of Homer, the curiosity of Eratosthenes, The integrity of Cato, the courage of St. Boniface, the vision of Michelangelo, the mirth of Mozart, the insights of Descartes, Hume, and Kant, the wit of Voltaire, the ingenuity of Watt, the moral urgency of Lincoln and Douglas. These and many more are responsible for the unique tradition into which we have been born. And it is this tradition, and no other, which has produced those foundational ideas we all too often take for granted or assume are the defaults around the world. I am speaking here of the freedom of expression, of inquiry, of conscience. I am speaking of the rule of law and equality under the law. I am speaking of inalienable rights, of trial by jury, of respect for women, of constitutional order and democratic procedure. I am speaking of evidence-based reasoning and religious tolerance. Now, those are all things I wouldn't give up for all the tea in China. You can have Karl Marx, we'll give you him, but these are ours. They are the precious gems of our magnificent Western tradition, and if we do nothing else worthwhile in our lives, we can at least safeguard these things from contamination or annihilation by those who would thoughtlessly squander their inheritance. And to those around the world who wish to join us or adopt our ways, you are more than welcome. The Western tradition is an open tradition, although we insist that those who do join us leave behind those aspects of their traditions that contradict ours. That's the deal. And over the centuries, many have found it to be a good deal, including many brilliant and fascinating Chinese who in America and elsewhere have thrived, flourished, and in time made their own outstanding contributions to the Western way of life. Well, class, we're nearly at time, so I won't keep you. I hope you take what I've said into consideration, and if the opportunity arises, perhaps you may want to visit that museum in your town, or listen to a symphony, or pay a visit to your local library, where you can learn about many of the things I've been mentioning. You see, whenever I feel lost or alone, or whenever the world seems troubled and the future bleak, for myself, I've always taken comfort in the simple joy of cracking open a good book with which to do the reading. James O'Flaherty. I guess we've got a few more minutes. I almost forgot. I still got my Chinese doctor joke. Do any of you want to hear it? Okay, but this doesn't leave the room now. Promise me. I mean, I could get in real big trouble here, so please, just don't repeat this. All right, here it goes. There was once a man who...
Media matters for America. Go fuck yourself.